last year. It had some of the same speakers. And so I didn't want to have to go and listen again.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. That's fair enough. But it was interesting to listen to her story.
Bella is a separate. Bella's a good friend of mine.
Loic.
Bella's a really good journalist and someone who takes it very seriously.
Obviously pronouncing his name wrong. So it's
very indicative of the kind of environment within which people are working. But that's a separate story. So I think to generalize from that is problematic, and I think that people tend to do that, and it doesn't really tend to reflect the nuance of what's happening on the ground. And so these sessions can be off-putting for me.
Yeah, no, I can see that. I can see that. And you're right. We never get to the nuances in those big topics.
I really don't know for Perugia why you would have an Egypt session 2 years in a row with basically the same formation, even if not the same persons. I mean, there are lots of people out there, local stakeholders that could have been brought in to talk to the topic critically.
Guys, I think we're about to start. No, that's all right. One other thing I will do is get each of you to introduce yourselves, I think, rather than me having to read out a long list of just say, just a sentence about what it is that you do. It's more animated. Excuse me, technical colleagues up the back. Do you want me just to start? Or are you going to give me a countdown for...
Let's give it a couple more minutes now.
Yeah, but I just want to know whether they...
Oh, no, I think you're right.
Hey, thank you. What do you reckon, 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay.
What is it?
I'm going to give it 5. Have you tweeted anything to say come? Because I haven't, and I probably should.
Oh,
Maria, can you open your Twitter?
Yeah, sure. I already tweeted this morning.
Did you?
Yes, to say come help the UN.
Good. I'm just going to share that one.
I tag you all.
You're not talking to a row of empty chairs and people at the back.
Yeah, we're going to have a better discussion.
Can you see what the password is? On the one in front there, what's the password?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. 5J.
I didn't get to finish my coffee. This could be a disaster.
There's no Wi-Fi on the normal channel.
You're based in London?
Yes.
How often do you come to New York?
We're just going to give this 5 minutes, guys, because it's Saturday morning and people were up very late, and we're hoping others will join us. Have you found a network?
Team IFJ.
No, I can't even get that.
Let's see. I'm very bad at this. I'm not one of the generation of the selfie culture. So I should stand up, right? You think I'll
Did you see the message from Chris saying that the images and the video are already embedded under the panel description on the website?
I didn't.
It's probably the worst selfie.
So you don't need to...
I just need to ask if they...
Oh, they're happy. He sent an email saying it's...
Julie,
Oh, there you are. Oh, thank you, Maria.
This password doesn't work for me.
Me, yeah. I do that all the time. RJF18PG #10. One more minute and then we'll go. Do you guys have access? Journalism. We should have tweeted a link to the video as well as live live video. Mm. The thing about this room, the acoustics aren't brilliant and the microphones pop quite badly. So just a little warning, you might need to back off.
Anybody else come in the past minute?
No. Do you want to start? Okay. Okay, thanks for joining us this morning. I know it's relatively early on a Saturday. My name is Julie Pizzetti. I'm an Australian journalist and academic, and I've brought this panel together partly because of an association with UNESCO, which is the UN agency that deals in the defence and protection of freedom of expression, which is essential to our work as journalists. Guy Berger, to my right, is the Director of Freedom of Expression and Media Development at UNESCO, and he's going to be speaking to you about a project that the UN has underway, which is seeking to help secure the future of the internet. And our job is to try to help them put journalism, I think, at the centre of that process. So I've got a really esteemed panel of people together to talk about some of the issues at the core of this. Guy, I've just shared your title, but do you want to say a little bit about yourself? Perhaps your connection to journalism would be helpful.
Thank you, Julie, and thanks for organising this panel and the fantastic panellists we have. So I work at UNESCO. I've been there 6 years. And before that, I was a journalism educator and a journalist. So I think once you have been a journalist, there's no cure for journalism. It stays with you your whole life. So now that I've been at UNESCO, I've been trying to see what does the UN do about these kinds of issues of communications in the digital age. And in particular, I inherited a system when I came to UNESCO of looking at indicators to map different countries, and I'll speak a bit about that, to map countries' communications landscapes and then to propose changes to the governments and other stakeholders in those countries. So that's where this whole exercise comes in.
All right. I might move to Maria Ressa, to your right. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and perhaps just a sentence about what the UN's role in terms of engaging with journalism as you've experienced it has meant?
I've been a journalist for more than 3 decades, almost the eldest here, I think, even older than I started a startup called Rappler in the Philippines, and I don't like the fact that we are now kind of at the forefront of the government's attacks on media in the Philippines, because in January this year, the government tried to shut us down. We're fighting it legally, but we're trying to figure out whether rule of law exists. The UN and UNESCO has been incredibly pivotal for my own thinking personally as a journalist. These two actually helped me speak at the very beginning about the attacks that I was getting last year. 90 hate messages per hour, and I just kind of, at one dinner, I said, Julie, this is happening, and I was keeping quiet about it, and then the two of them talked, and all of a sudden, I felt I had help. So that's great, and I hope that what we can do today is to take this and give as much help as I got to others who need it.
Thank you. Fatima.
Okay, my name is Fatma Farag, and I'd also like to thank Julie and UNESCO for having this panel and for having me as a part of it. I am an Egyptian journalist. I've been working for over 20 years as a journalist. I am currently the founder and CEO of a local media company, Wilad Al Balad, and we are the only media organization in Egypt focused on developing independent local media across the country. So particularly interested in that aspect of media engagement and empowerment. I'm also the regional director for WAN IFRA's Women in News program in the MENA region, working to improve gender parity across newsrooms in the Middle East and also with a component in Africa. I'm also a board member of the World Editors Forum.
the WEF. With regards to the UN, of course, the UN, as an Egyptian journalist, as someone who's working to develop thematic journalism within Egypt and specialized journalism, is a very important sort of partner and stakeholder in allowing us and giving us the opportunity and sort of the resources to develop that type of work. But also more specifically related to journalistic rights and rights of journalism, we've been active in the campaign that was developed by UNESCO against impunity against journalists, and this is a particularly important topic for those of us working in Egypt and in the Middle East region, and so that again has been an important framework to be involved in.
Okay. From CNN, is this one working?
Wait,
You're
this
going
one?
to have both.
I can have two of them. So I'm Inga Thodor, I'm the executive editor for CNN Digital International. And I guess the sort of my kind of different approach into this panel is this sort of global reach of CNN and the fact that we, we've worked very much on the free and unfettered access to information globally, which is a really big issue. So, reading through this document and knowing that what the situation is in many countries and the access that those countries would have to our journalism is something that is really dear to my heart. So I'm really pleased that we've managed to get this panel together.
Good morning, Raju Narisetti. I'm the CEO of a group of websites called the Gizmodo Media Group, at least until 10 more days. I've run newsrooms in Europe, Asia, and the US, and that's my kind of broader interest in this particular topic. I'm also on the board of the Wikimedia Foundation, which runs Wikipedia, and access issues are really important in terms of thinking about free flow of information, and something like this is very vital for that.
Okay, great. So I'm going to hand to you, Guy, to tell us all about the project and what it means to this group of people.
Sure. Let me get this mouse ready. Okay. So this is the way that UNESCO is trying to figure out a tool whereby we can make sense of the internet at the country level. Of course, the internet's much wider than the country level, but it's the country level where some changes can be made, hopefully to improve things. This model is based on these 4 principles, which we summarize as Rome, so it's very easy to remember. And the member states of UNESCO, which is 195, they all agreed that this is a good approach to understand the internet. It doesn't deal with all aspects of the internet. If we were the World Bank, we'd obviously be highlighting different aspects, but for UNESCO, we highlight these ones, which is rights, openness, accessibility, and multi-stakeholder participation. So it's 4 principles. It sounds like a very nice model. It's sort of, to use the Americanism, motherhood and apple pie. I don't know whether that is politically correct to say, motherhood and apple pie, but anyway, parenthood and apple pie probably, or whatever you want. But these are great principles. I don't think anybody can quibble with these principles, and I think even governments that don't always implement or respect these principles, they can't deny them, because these are principles that are agreed now by all of them in their collective space at UNESCO. So what's quite important about this is that the internet, if we didn't have these elements, we wouldn't have the internet as it is today. It has only grown up on the basis of a lot of these characteristics. Maybe unevenly in different parts of the world, but fundamentally this is what makes up the internet. And if you want the internet for everybody, for everywhere, you need to have these principles being really respected. How do you give these principles something that's a bit more powerful, give them a bit more teeth so you can really implement them? Well, you've got to assess what does it mean on the ground. So multi-stakeholder participation, for example, which is fundamental to the design and the origin and the functioning of the internet. How do you assess, are policies being made on a multi-stakeholder basis? What does it mean? In what places is it happening or not happening? So this is where the indicators come in. And it's based on this experience of the media development indicators that UNESCO has had for about 10 years. Media indicators, I'm sure it's very obvious to you. You would assess the legal environment, the economic environment, technical environment, capacity, and so on. And then you'd make recommendations to improve the media environment. And that's what's happened with these media indicators in places like Tunisia, Jordan, in Latin America, and a number of countries there, in different African countries. These indicators have been used for the media, and they've really led to a lot of momentum for change because, one, you have like a really evidence-based mapping of what the media situation is compared to international standards. And two, you've got the credibility of a UNESCO sort of stamp on this thing, that the recommendations carry weight. So now today, of course, we live in a different universe. It's not just media as a system in itself. And that's what brings us to these new indicators, which, if I could just push this. So, left click, not the right click. Okay. So ones were parallel universes. So it's very easy, but let me interact with you a little bit. Oops, somehow it got cut off. Technical people, can you show that? Show the slide, please.
We've lost connection. Thank you.
There we go. Okay. So which of these circles represents the media and which represents the internet? Okay. What color is media? Yellow. Okay. So once upon a time, you had a small internet and you had a big media, and then you had a bit of an overlap between them, with slightly shrinking media, and now you have the media at the center, not the center, but squarely within this environment. Now, this is really a fundamental change in the ecosystem, and it means that basically what is happening in the internet is going to impact on the media, I mean, like it or not. And I think there's some obvious things that we know about blocking, filtering, for example. I mean, these are fundamental to what's going to happen to media. It's not just blocking and filtering hate speech from some group of extremists on the right. These are things, what if the media is reporting on ISIS, and that gets blocked, a media report on ISIS? So this blocking filtering is really fundamental. I mean, now what's the broad regime for the internet has huge relevance to what's happening to people in the media. More and more, of course, now we have the intermediaries, and their curation role is really becoming fundamental. People know that Facebook has chopped and changed over the past 2 years as to whether it's going to put news media into the news feed or take it out the news feed. It's been experimenting in different countries. This is enormous. What Facebook is doing has huge implications for the survival and the visibility of media. So their curation role is something that's big also. I'll turn to the question of cybersecurity or network security. What's happening on the internet is also, again, huge for media. If you're a media outlet and you're being subject to DDoS attacks and being knocked out, this is not just something that's happening to you in the media. It depends on the cybersecurity regime in the country and the preparedness of the country as a whole and the ability to deal with these kinds of issues. Then, of course, you come to the kind of cyber bullying, cyber intimidation that Marisa has now. Of course, journalists are experiencing this probably more than many other people, and women journalists especially more. But there's a culture out there which is not just impact on the media, it's a broader culture. So again, we're not going to address the culture for the media, vis-a-vis the media, without looking at the bigger internet ecosystem. I'd also just give one last example here, which is one of the principles of this internet model is access. Now, access to the internet is really critical for access to media on the internet. The costs of access in a country affects, first of all, basically how many people are going to access media online. But as you may know, probably you do, in developing countries, people use ad blockers. Why do they use ad blockers? Because when ads come through your system, it uses up your bandwidth, your airtime. So people use ad blockers, not because they're trying to block the ads, but because they're trying to reduce their data consumption. So you block the ads, and what does it mean for the media? So, you know, the overall affordability of the internet has got huge implications for the business model of media. So these are just some examples about how this parallel universe has changed. I can tell you, I go to lots of internet conferences where people are discussing these big issues, and there's very few media people there, very few journalists. And these internet people, some are keen on human rights, and some are keen on connectivity, and some are keen on access, and some are keen on multi-stakeholder participation and intellectual property and so on, but they don't get the importance of journalism and media. in this ecosystem. For them, it's just one of many things, and it's not the interest, fine. But unless the people who are interested in media, and news media in particular, and journalism in particular, unless people like this get involved, it's going to be an internet that moves at its own pace, in its own directions, and one of the casualties could be journalism. So that's the kind of big picture, and why we are appealing you today is it's part of a consultation that UNESCO has been having for about a year on what do stakeholders think. And so we've gone to a lot of conferences and had regional events, and again, not many media people participating. So now we are here in Perugia. Julie organized an event 2 days ago with journalism educators. Thank you, Julie. And now we have some other people, and we have some excellent journalistic focused, passionate, insightful people here who can help UNESCO make sure that our indicators are going to really include the importance of journalism in this new ecosystem. So there are 5 categories, the 4 ROAM, and then there's some cross-cutting indicators. So I'll just give you a bit of a taste so you can see what they're about. I have one more copy of the publication here, if anybody's just come in late and you'd like to get a copy. You've all got, okay. So because you've got it, I'm not going to go into detail, but for example, if you look at rights is quite complicated because there's the right to information, there's the right to expression, there's the right to, when you expression, you speak about the right to impart information and the right to receive, which are 2 different dimensions, complementary. Right to association, privacy, of course, you know, the right to be forgotten. There's also the right to reputation. All these things are vital. How they are respected on the internet or not impacts on the role of the media in these things. Examples here is that do people, including media, have access to due process to address violations of rights? If your rights to publish are being violated by the intermediary company, by the government, by bullies and thugs, mobsters online, trolls, what is your right to redress? These are important questions. There's censorship, which Inga was speaking about, and so on and so forth. So I won't go into more detail here, but you can see the kind of issues that one would want to make a comprehensive assessment of as to what is the situation and then what recommendations do you have, in as much as national policies can improve this situation. More and more, as you know, governments are catching up with the internet, more and more governments are regulating. So part of this is to say, if this is going to happen, let's try and get governments to do it in a way that respects international standards and is actually good for the country, not just good for the people in power. Openness. So openness, often people say, we want an open internet, but UNESCO means this in quite a specific sense. So different, complementary, but different to the human rights space. Openness here is about the openness of markets. It's about openness of technical standards. It's about the openness of content, because if you don't have this, you don't have the internet. So here, what's very important is, to what extent does a country have laws that will stop economic concentration? Okay, to what extent will the country have some kind of dispensation that will look at the independent management of the domain name system? Because if you want to set up a news website with a certain name and it's being blocked by government, this is impacting on your ability to be an entrepreneur and have your registration there. If you look at the last one here, well, the second last one, net neutrality, obviously has a huge impact on the question of openness and then ultimately on media and access. Well, you know, if you don't have open data, data journalism is basically a non-starter. You can't do data journalism without open data. Okay. The accessibility, it's a ROA. Accessibility covers, as I indicated earlier, things like affordability, local content, local language. So I'm not going to go into detail here, but you can see those kind of things. There are some examples. Maybe I could just have one thing here. Let me highlight, say, number 4, disabilities. Clearly, media people have an interest in media content reaching disabled people and including disabled people's concerns, given the huge percentage of society that is disabled. So how accessible the internet is for disabled people becomes an issue. The second last one, the multi-stakeholder participation. So to what extent when the government makes laws that impact on the internet, like say in Europe, you have the right to be forgotten at the European Court of Justice. If a country is making a law, to what extent do they consult with the stakeholders, including media? That's national internet governance. International, because the internet is international. Who's making these international policy decisions? Examples here, well, I think that I won't spend time on that for now. The last one is cross-cutting indicators, which includes the gender issues, trust and security, children and young people, legal and ethical aspects. These don't fit easily into this ROAM framework, but they are really issues that I think permeate throughout. So, for example, does the state have policies for gender equality? Because this impacts hugely on media, it impacts hugely on the internet. What about intimidation, the abuse of the internet for intimidation? Are there policies that stop cyberbullying, which could be used for journalists to defend themselves against threats and so on? I've mentioned cybersecurity, and so number 4 is there a national, cyber emergency response team, CERT or equivalent? Okay, and so to wrap up, now what we really want to get from this consultation today is if there are any other themes, questions, or indicators that are of interest for you as media people, as people who care about journalism, that should need a special indicator, because a lot of these indicators are very relevant to what you do, but is there anything that's left out that should be added that will really make a specific assessment in a country? So to wrap up, what we'll do is in the next few months, we will road test these draft indicators in a number of countries, and then we'll revise them, and then we present them back to the member states, and we say, you've got the concept, here's the indicators, do you agree to them? If they agree, then you've got an international standard about how to assess the internet, which sets the kind of bar for what the internet should be in a country. And then we find countries that are interested. I mean, we don't have capacity or resources to foist this on every country. We've got to do it in cooperation, but there must be multi-stakeholder processes that govern the research using these indicators in a country. And particularly what's important is if you can get the governments involved in this, then governments are part of the process, and the recommendations have a greater chance of being implemented. That's been our experience with our other indicators, and this is what we hope with the internet indicators. Voila.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
And really important to get an understanding of how this relates to journalism, for the sake of journalism. Maria Ressa, I'm going to get you to address this. I know it's complex material, but hopefully you'll take away the document and engage with it and share it and discuss it within your groups as well. But within it, you'll see, as Guy's outlined, are a range of themes, these Rome principles that he was talking about. Maria is going to address rights and cross-cutting issues, which one of our academic colleagues the other day referred to as miscellaneous, and I think it's the issues that cut across all of these other categories. Maria, what's your perspective?
So I have just 3 points on it. Like the first one, which I think we all pulled out, is what happens when you can't trust government? Because primarily the main actors are governments, right? And while the level playing field is supposed to be social media, well, social media is now in the power of, under the control of more authoritarian style government. So the first one is, how can we make this something that we can all use if we're not government? The second is the concept of as journalists, we used to create information one by one. We still do. We have no choice. That still is the reason why I think journalism is critical to society, right? There is no more critical time than now for the mission of what we do. And yet, the flood of information that's come out, and Guy, you mentioned this a little bit, that in more of curation, but I think there's a fundamental difference between the core content creation, the journalism, and then the ripple of that, which you would call curation. But so for me, it's looking at the impact of big data on our role as journalists and how governments have moved away from censorship, where they used to control what would come out when we were probably the #1 and #2, right? You know, the yellow and the blue. Now that it is the internet with little yellow journalists, the tool of choice for most autocrats and dictators to be is not to censor, but to flood, and to flood to the point of weakening journalists, weakening institutions of trust, weakening trust, and then actually bashing the fracture lines of society, because the mode of spread is social media. Anger spreads fastest on social media. So now that journalists are no longer the gatekeepers and we're actually getting eaten up by the chaos theory, and governments have learned that and are exploiting social media, who are the gatekeepers? You know, how do you even begin to think about regulation or finding consensus? Like, we do self-regulation as journalists. We're pushing the platforms to do that, but is any of this possible? And then finally, the last one connects to the point of instead of censorship, you are flooding to the point of meaninglessness. It's that freedom of expression is actually being used to stifle freedom of expression, and the very principles here under freedom of expression are being used against journalists, right? And against people. And the example I'll use for that is the drug war in the Philippines. In July of 2017, we went from, not that many people, we went from the drug war being started, and when it began, you had an average of 8 people killed every night. Our reporters would come back from that. And we would do the stories, but when it spreads on social media, anyone who questioned the killings would then be attacked. And the attacks were vicious. So those people, what did they do? And that includes journalists. They quieted down. They stopped talking about their values. In fact, if you go online on Facebook, you would think that the values have transformed dramatically. And this is that moving line of how you transform and manufacture both consensus and how you transform the values at the basis of a society. So those are, when the very tool that we're trying to use to protect is actually now used to subvert.
Which is an incredibly powerful point and very difficult as a challenge. Thanks very much, Maria. I'm going to come back and unpack some of this with you as we progress the discussion. But I want to move to Raju now, who's going to talk to us in the context of access and openness. And I think we need to come back to this openness question because of the issues Maria's raised and others have, and perhaps reimagine what that means. But give us your take, Raju.
Yeah, so part of the challenge of having journalists or ex-journalists on a panel like this is that we typically tend to be very skeptical of efforts like this. But I want to kind of push back against my own instinct as well, because I think something like this is very critical in terms of allowing third parties, if you will, NGOs or other organizations, to use this as a framework to then actually kind of start thinking about how do we cross-compare countries and how do we rank them. It is going to be challenging for UNESCO to get into the ranking business. But what they're providing, I think, here is a very important kind of a framework that allows others to kind of say, how does Zimbabwe compare against Malaysia? Or how does India do against Turkey? And using some of these principles around both access and openness. And one of the fundamental goals here is to improve things, not just kind of criticize the current status quo. And I think this goes a long way in that. I was in India about a month ago at an event where the Vice President of India was there, and I cited the Reporters Without Borders annual ranking of press freedoms and pointed out to him that India is ranked 137th out of 188, which is kind of surprising that it's so low. But what I pointed out was that Afghanistan, where people actually die doing their jobs, is ranked 126th, much better than India. I'm like, right there, there's some, you could disagree with the underlying principles, but right there's a problem in India that you need to address. So I think having these kind of benchmarks goes a long way in raising the awareness. But I want to talk a little bit about what happens. As with all things, UN and UNESCO, because of the multi-stakeholder thing, they take a while to become final reality. I think this is going to become reality in September, hopefully. But I'm more interested in thinking about, so what happens next? Do we put out a report and walk away from it and let everybody else kind of figure out what to do with it? Or is there a way we can help organizations that are then applying this framework to countries to say, here are some things to watch out for, even though we are giving you a bigger framework, here's a good way to use it. And there are 2 or 3 examples that I want to talk about that worry me a little bit. I think the framework is comprehensive, but how do we reconcile the existence of laws or existence of a legal system with the reality of a law or a legal system? I'll give you an example. Wikipedia has been not accessible in Turkey now for 10 months, I think 11 months. You can't get it. The government just shut it down. So the normal, if you apply this indicator, you will say, okay, so Turkey has a legal system and laws, so Wikipedia could go to them, file a thing. But the reality of Turkey is, A, the courts are all now increasingly stacked by judges who are pro-government. But more importantly, this case doesn't ever come up. So having something on paper as a law, and then how does the judiciary act, and if the case never ever comes up, by this indicator, Turkey would have a check mark against having the right laws, but in practice, it would be failing it completely. So how do you reconcile that? And I think those are the kinds of things that are worth figuring out and helping third-party organizations to kind of say, also think about these other practical issues in applying this framework. Very similarly, when you look at access and improvement, the idea of having a national ID or database is a good thing, right? I mean, India is doing the world's largest biometric database called Aadhaar, where everybody's fingerprints, and it allows you to, on paper, take out corruption, have everybody have access to the same services, but at the same time, the data that's being collected and how well it's being protected and what's happening to it gives a completely different problem, even though India would rank very high on having access being open to 1 billion people. So I think things like that are worth focusing on to say that what do we do after September to make this much more robust in terms of its actual use cases. I think oftentimes organizations tend to move on to the next thing. It'll be important to kind of not do that in this context because I think so much effort has gone into creating what's a really good framework, to maybe spend the next couple of years actually saying, here are some practical things of how to use this and encourage others to do more rankings and cross-country comparisons. I think that would be a much higher benefit of an exercise like this. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Really practical and helpful. Inge, we're going to come to you next with a focus on rights and openness.
Yeah. So I think both Raju and Maria have sort of pointed out the main things that I wanted to say too around that the accountability of nation states to monitor their own sort of actions is not working in so many parts of the world. So, so having a national legal framework is not enough. So I think that, the system that Raju was talking about, where you can at least sort of name and shame or rank countries is a really necessary kind of action to take and a motivator, probably the strongest motivators that countries would have to deal with or wanting to at least appear higher in those things. I mean, you know, frankly, as a believer in the free internet and access, I do think that there should also be some kind of stick to go with the carrot, if in any way possible. Although I know that that would be a sort of a hard sell. I think that the other things that we kind of I wanted to mention in parts of the rights issue is that self-censorship is mentioned a few times. Now, this is almost an impossible thing to measure. I mean, if you are self-censoring in the first place, chances are that you're not going to come out and say, I am self-censoring, because you're doing it out of fear, or you're doing it out of, you know, I mean, it could sometimes be business reasons because you're worried that what's going to happen to your business. But on the whole, you are doing it for negative reasons, should we say. So the measurements of how that, if you're doing that, is difficult. I mean, I think the other thing that is mentioned in a few places, and I think one of them was around openness, about how many people blog in each country. Again, it's lacking. What do you expect? What, 60% of the population to be blogging? 30%? I mean, I'm from Iceland, where, you know, 90% of the people have published their own books, so they're probably all blogging as well. So where do you set the standards of what that is? So kind of giving people guidance of, we would expect this kind of or a minimum or participation for this indicator to work. So I think that's another one. There are a couple of things I wanted to mention around the rights as well. One of them being a really big issue about privacy. Obviously, there's very different approaches to this in the world, and I think that if there is some kind of document like this that could bring it all together about, there's very strong privacy law coming in the UK, in the Europe as a whole with the GDPR. You know, those rights aren't as protected in other parts of the world. Is there any way for us to kind of really realize, are these working? Are the European ones working? Are they a good framework for this? Mm-hmm. Should we be looking at that? Or are other ways sort of better to be dealing with it? And finally, just on openness, Maria talks about them sort of flooding the internet, and that's how they kind of deal with journalism. I also think that on censorship, instead of doing censorship, going into the into media companies and censoring, which I, by the way, do believe that they're still doing in many places, the way that countries deal with this is to shut down the internet itself. And there's a huge difference between just kind of taking Wikipedia off or saying, we will only give you access to a very small part of this internet. I mean, I once had the absolute privilege and pleasure of interviewing and speaking to Tim Berners-Lee, and he compared the internet to a library and said, can you imagine if you went into a library and you could only pick 3 books, but you can see all the other ones, but you're not allowed to touch them. So I think that that was a really good sort of analogy of what the internet is. So you're standing in this room, but you can't touch it. And so I think that this measure of shutting down access, not just to media, but information to rule out access to journalism is incredibly important. And then I did find it interesting, just as a sort of minor point, that you mentioned VPNs in the openness, which is a really interesting point. But it sort of fails to look at that VPN's access can often infringe copyrights as well. So I think that that's another thing. If you're using VPN for access to something in a different country, you're infringing copyrights. And now I'm also a strong believer in copyright, so there would have to be some kind of a protection for that. And just because Julie asked me to read this as a journalist, and I did my editing like it was like it was a proper piece that was given to me by one of my journalists, I just want to make one point, is that it's not clear to me from the beginning what the stand is on it. I mean, is UNESCO what the stand is? It's like, is this supposed to be, I mean, it almost just needs a sentence in the beginning saying, UNESCO believes there should be free access to the internet. You know, I think the core message was a bit lost on me in the when I was reading it. So I would have probably asked my writer to go back and say, make this a little bit clearer for me.
They want a headline and a good, strong lead. Excellent, thank you, Inki. Farah, would you like to address the themes that you've been assigned?
Okay, well, I approach this from a practitioner's point of view, so a journalist, not a specialist on policy. And for me, what struck me most is that we're talking constantly about governments. Governments are the ones shutting down the space and the ones that we need to sort of regulate around. But at the same time, when I'm doing business, often government doesn't really have to bother about that because business is shutting me down. The business algorithms and models that have developed around the internet between the tech companies and the big platforms essentially make it very difficult for smaller organizations and smaller operators and independent ones to be able to be seen. So we're there, but if you can find us, you're lucky if you can, because we don't have the resources to push content, to show up on the search engines at the top of the list. You'd really have to scroll quite far down to be able to find us, not because that content is not important, not because it is not relevant or highly content, but because we simply do not have the resources to push it. And if you don't have money anymore, then you really can't be seen very well within that space. And this has taken away this idea that the internet is an open space and a leveling playing field for all. And so for me, this is an essential point that should be sort of somehow dealt with within the context of trying to create indicators that ensure that this remains a space or returns to becoming a space that everyone can be seen in and have sort of equal representation within. So, and just when you were mentioning the domain names and how we manage that, in Egypt, the government isn't making it difficult for you to buy a domain, but what happens is there's this business. People will buy up domains that they know you might take, and then they'll take the Facebook pages and Twitter accounts handles for that as well. And then if you want it, you have to approach them and buy it from them. And that is an inhibitor. So that relates to how business is managed, not the government actually going in and shutting down the space. So regulations perhaps, or indications around how this business is managed. And then this idea of the flooding, and of course this happens in the intimidation around that, and that is of course a very serious reality. But also there is the fact that people go to what it is they think they want to see, and the internet algorithms and modus of sort of operation supports that. And so, for example, if you look at the Middle East, you'll find that I think the first 100 most important URLs will be religious content sites, because this is what people are going to, and that also drowns out different perspectives, other views, independent journalism, and what have you. People are going to entertainment, are going to religious content, are going to sports, and the algorithms are supporting that this is what they're constantly seeing. And what you're finding within the media industry as we go to all these different congresses that tell us how to deal with the constraints that we face in terms of business development is that now one of the keys is customization of content. And so as we further customize to be able to beat the system, what we wind up doing is compromising all of that independent journalism and other viewpoints that we need to get out there and that should be existent within this space and make it a diverse space. So there's that as well to think about, and how that is impacting how also journalists do business. So really increasing access to what? To which content, and the importance of focusing on that. The processes of how this comes together, and you were mentioning about the conferences and how journalists are never there. Perhaps part of the process is that the people from within the media industry who can actually make it to the conferences, who can afford to be there, who are represented within those rooms, are not necessarily the people who take this the most seriously or understand it the best and are able to actually make inputs that would be relevant to this. And hence maybe adjusting that process to ensure that stakeholders within newsrooms that can actually, and within the media ecosystems that can impact are there. I think yesterday Julie was mentioning that as this is being rolled out, it will be tested within NGOs. Newsrooms function in a way which is very unaccepting, perhaps, of the impact of that which comes from without them, outside of them. So, and you see this in different things, for example, in gender. And so people from NGOs, civil society, that come in with agendas around gender, equality, and parity, this is something that's considered not part of what it is that we do. belongs to them, we might cover it, we might be interested, it doesn't impact the way we as journalists practice. So if you want to have, for example, a gender program that is impactful, you would probably want to start designing it within that space within which you want to see the impact. I think the same argument is really relevant to this process as well. Okay. Maybe part of it should not just be within civil society and government, but also should really include practitioners of journalism from within their newsrooms. And that perhaps would impact that comment you were making about the document itself, and I think all of us maybe felt a bit alienated from when reading it, and we needed to make an extra effort to sort of understand it, even though it is extremely relevant to what it is that we do. And that maybe as it rolls out to a wider audience, especially within the journalistic community, that you would think about the kinds of tools and the kinds of jargon and that can be used within newsrooms and can impact them and be understood by those people working within that sector. Finally, I guess so that I don't take up too much time, all right, sorry, is the issue of the cross-cutting. So there were different things that I took note of, particularly, especially, for example, that which relates to culture content. And again, I'll relate this to my personal experience within Egypt, and we work with we work in cultural heritage conservation, so we have a bit. There are budgets that are allocated by government to the Ministry of Culture and to the various bodies for internet content and media awareness around this. These budgets either remain unspent or they are used to develop content that no one is ever going to look at, simply because they do not, adhere to what it is that people will look for when looking on the internet. And so here is really the issue of capacity. So you can have a government that will check that they actually did that, they did allocate, they did think, they did take measures, but they didn't develop anything that would actually be impactful. And so perhaps also focusing on that and thinking about really the capacity of local governments in being able to implement that and who the relative partners would be in making that a reality is something also to include in that. And then finally with the media literacy, and that relates again to the capacity development. And for example, again, we work with local schools. There are budgets allocated by the Ministry of Education to these schools to do media literacy training. They don't know how to spend it, and this is a big, big problem. And it just shows you where the resource can be available and just not used. So again, how can this be included into the parameters to ensure that it's not just ticking that box that the resource is there, but that actually we're able to implement it and in a way that is meaningful. Thank you.
May I quickly jump in on
absolutely.
one point? It's a very important point where what looks like a positive indicator can often be a negative indicator as well, and that's important to. So the idea that government allocates funds for development of media or news literacy and all on paper is a good thing, right? But the reality in a lot of countries is that same fund or the ability to support media can be used in a very powerful way to make sure there's like censorship without saying it. I mean, India is again a good example where the Indian government is the largest single advertiser for all newspapers. Right? That gives them so much unsated power to be able to say, maybe we will pull advertising from your brand to go to a different brand. And I think so it's important to kind of always flag that what might look like a positive indicator, worth checking if it can turn into a negative indicator.
It's almost like A/B testing your indicators, the positive and negative. Okay, great, thank you. Some really rich feedback there, and really, I think you would agree, important feedback. And I might start with that point. We'll go in reverse order. I'm going to get Guy, without notice, to respond to some of the points that you've made. And let's start with a point that Fatima made, which is, I think it has to be acknowledged, the fact that this process has been going on for a year, and this is probably the first time at this conference that there's been active direct engagement with working journalists. Is that a fair critique about these sorts of processes? And if it is, how do you respond to Fatima's suggestions around ensuring that these issues that are fundamental to the sustainability of journalism get active traction among the journalists working in the world, not just the NGOs representing them?
Well, first of all, I just want to thank everybody for really thought-provoking and stimulating comments, and I will I've taken 6 pages of notes, so I definitely would take this really seriously. In terms of your challenge, Julie, I think that in the nature of this thing, this is not a popular kind of research instrument that, you know, is for each and every single stakeholder to sort of, you know, get into the nitty-gritties. For example, Inga was mentioning VPNs, which is an indicator, but I don't know, even here amongst journalists, how many journalists even know what is a VPN? So it is a certain level of expertise that is required, and there's a certain level of jargon because it's the UN and because it's, in the end, this thing is also, it's got to be used in countries by people who can do the research under the guidance of a multi-stakeholder committee. So it's not a document to speak directly to everybody, put it that way. And at the same time, we've also got to develop this at this stage as something that will be in the discourse of the member states, which is the diplomatic kind of terminology and so on. When you come to implement it, then it should be, you know, a bit more popularized, and people should be involved, and there should be focus groups involving lots of different actors, including the newsroom people and so on. And then the report itself that comes out of the application in whatever country you're talking about, that report has got a lot of potential to be used in very popular forms to say, you know, recommendation 1, there should be assessment of budgets, how they spent for internet content. You know, okay, that's a bit boring, but you could turn into a popular kind of tweet or meme even, one point that comes out of a report, and then build a campaign around that if you wanted to. So I think we shouldn't, okay, I think I'll stop. I've made my point.
Okay, no, but I think that, I'm sure that's a point you'll take away around the direct engagement of journalists at this stage of developing the very indicators that you then plan to road test. And this has, I think, been very useful from my observational position in that regard. So thank you for a range of inputs. Inga, to your point, I think on, correct me if I'm wrong, because there were so many great points. Guy was taking notes, I'm very glad. Standards, minimum standards was something that I think you said. So Guy, what is your reaction to that? It's a great idea that in having an indicator that you want people to measure against with a variety of test points, do you provide some sort of guidance notes that are kind of examples of positive implementation, which might also get to Raju's concern around the flip side of an indicator?
Yeah, this was a challenging point that Inga raised with a particular example about what is the optimum minimum number of percentage of the population who actually take advantage and blog. And I guess one could probably, depends what you mean by blog, because everybody on the Facebook page is putting up some content. So, you know, we need to kind of try and, I think we need to think a bit more about this. But I also think that countries are different, so you have to be a bit careful, because what is possible in some countries is not possible in other countries. And not only that example with, you know, how many people have access and can blog and are literate and so on and so forth, but even things like, is there multilingualism on the internet? In some countries this is extremely relevant, in other countries it's much less relevant. So it's hard to kind of have an absolutely universal kind of say. Ideally, you know, every country should have, you know, this sort of thing.
I think just one idea on that is that it can also be tied to literacy, you know, because if you expect certain literacy in each country and the access, then there could be some correlation between the two.
To the country, yeah. Sure.
Okay, and Raju's point around reconciling reality with the ideals of an indicator, what was your response to that? So the fact that you might have useful guidelines and principles and indicators, but in reality the impact or the outcome is quite distinct.
Well, I think it's also a wider point you made that, you know, it's contested because different actors want to come out looking good on this, you know, whether it's the big internet companies, whether it's the government, whether it's this ministry or that ministry, or even civil society. You know, everyone would like to use these indicators. And it is contested. And I think what's really important is that the indicators should not make it easy for one group to tick a box and kind of like, well, you know, like IFAD, no improvement needed, because everyone can actually improve. And so it's a way of trying to formulate those indicators, first of all, in a way that puts emphasis on the implementation, not just the... But I would say that sometimes, well, in most cases, to have a law is at least a starting point. Because if there's no law, then it's less likely you will have implementation. You can have a law and no implementation, but starting point is a law. But we need to go further. And then I think it's also very much in the implementation of these indicators stage that when you have a multi-stakeholder kind of advisory board monitoring the research process to really hammer and say, we've got to go deep, deep, deep into the implementation of a law. Not just kind of, yes, the law meets the standards. What does it mean actually on practice? So that's kind of almost a phase 2, I think. One phase, get the indicator right and point to not just the standard, but is it being applied properly? But then when you do the research, to go deep as well.
Okay, great, and continue that discussion. Do you want to say something in response?
Yeah, a little bit more of an omnibus question here, Guy, which is that what is the definition of success for this project, right? And then maybe we can work back from there. Is it's September getting most or all member countries to say, okay, we sign off on this? Is that success, or are there more things that you will say, we come back, I don't know, 3 years out, back here, have a panel and say, so what has happened? I'm curious about how you think about that.
Well, there's different successes. I think the number one success is we get unanimous endorsement of the member states that this is an international standard for assessing the internet, and that countries should try to live up to the standard. That would be number one. Number two, then we can start implementing the research process using this in a number of countries. We can't do all countries because not some countries, they don't want to do it, or there's not enough resources or whatever. But to do it in some countries and actually then say it made a difference, that actually it led to the change in policies on the part of the platforms, for example, or it led to a change on the part of the education system, the media information literacy, or it made it, the government made a commitment then to not cut the internet, the case that Inga was. So if we can check those, I think what's also important with these kind of indicators, and here I'm kind of maybe on thin ice a bit, but to come back after a few years and do it again in the same country and say, okay, well, nothing's happened, or there was progress, or it's gone backwards. Now, of course, why I say I'm on thin ice, because who knows, the internet may be so different, these indicators could be not so relevant in 3 years' time. But anyway, at least for the start. So I think those are the kind of successes that we would like to see. This thing is really useful. It's agreed. It's taken up. It leads to improvements at country level.
I guess that goes to the point that you were making too, which again, the thin ice analogy. But this is all changing so incredibly rapidly. Do you have a process where you revise the indicators regularly after this?
We certainly need it, but we don't have a. Okay. At this stage, we're just trying to finish the consultations, get them road tested, get them approved, try them in a number of countries as fully fledged indicators.
Okay. Julie, don't try to give Guy more grey hair.
Finally, to Maria, and I'm afraid it is going to cause the grey hair to get greyer. But it's the really difficult questions that Maria has posed around the weaponization of freedom of expression and openness against freedom of expression and the practice of journalism. I mean, this is an observation that I've heard other people make here, although not specifically in that manner, but the way in which what we believed would be so valuable and democratizing and sort of ensuring the security of journalism into the future is now being turned against so much of journalism's core role. What do you do about that? I mean, you're the Director of Freedom of Expression at UNESCO. What does it mean when states are weaponising that? And I realise I'm putting you in a difficult situation, but answer that as much as you feel you have the capacity to. How do you address it with the indicators?
I don't think we've probably addressed it clearly enough, but I think most people can agree, and certainly in terms of international standards, not all expression is protected by freedom of expression. If you're going to incite hostility, discrimination, or violence, you're not protected. So I wouldn't call that a use of freedom of expression. That is a violation of freedom of expression. In fact, it's legitimate to restrict those kinds of expressions. So those kinds of expressions, certainly one doesn't see that as the freedom of expression that you want, that you would recognize on the internet. There is a grayer area of of the flooding, which the flooding at the moment includes, illegal expression, as it were, but it includes also just
propagandistic.
Just
exponential lines.
I mean, not all. It's not in terms of international standards. It's not illegal to lie. I mean, it's you can't lie. You can't exaggerate.
In some countries, it's becoming illegal. False news, for example, or legislation.
Well, but that raises a whole lot of other issues.
Indeed.
But at any rate, so. How does journalism stand up against disinformation which does not cross that threshold of
illegality,
of intimidation for hostility, discrimination, and violence? So that is a really big challenge. How you're going to make a distinction, between these two, or get some sense of what is the proportion of bad stuff, but I think the remedies are different. That's what I'm saying. One remedies are the states have an obligation to stop, hate speech in this particular defined way, and in fact, this is in the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. If you look at that they are supposed to actually take action against that, and there are some UN mechanisms that can be approached to kind of try and get compliance in this, like the UN Human Rights Council and the UN Human Rights Committee, two related bodies in Geneva, because states have obligations. The other stuff, that becomes, I think there's different remedies that are required now. So part of it is in what recommendations do you make coming out of these assessments. But coming to this point also that what do you do when a government is really involved in trying to, in this big internet arena, trying to kind of shrink independent journalism even more, or even push it out. And to be honest, I don't think these indicators are going to change a huge amount there. But Roger made a very important observation, and Inga, actually, I think about the role of third parties and the role of naming and shaming and so on. This is not something that the UN will do in terms of it's an intergovernmental body, but the kind of data that's produced is available for society and third-party actors to advocate on. And people, I think, should also, this is a tough thing to say, but you're not going to get the UN to sort out the problems, even with the UN, with the Security Council. They can't sort out the problems in a given country. Ultimately, you can use international stuff up to a point, and these indicators can do it up to a point, but it's got to be your local stakeholders who've got to drive change. I'm sorry, but you just don't get social change from the outside in a country. It can support.
And journalism is central to that, right? I mean, that's in terms of applying pressure.
Yeah, and international solidarity with journalism is absolutely critical and so on, but unless journalists themselves are mobilized within their country to try and fight for the values, whether it's through using this kind of instrument or many other things, you can't expect a society to advance if it's just from outside pressure.
Let me pause for a moment. We have about 5 minutes for questions. I'm sorry, there's a difficult issues to unpack, and there's been some really important contributions there, I think. But does anybody in the audience, any of the stakeholders in the audience, have a comment or a question? Yeah, Mira up the front.
Hi, Mira Salva from the Reuters Institute. Thanks. Kind of from a journalistic background, the one thing that struck me was something you touched on, content. What kind of journalism do we want to promote via this? And there is very much an issue, like you said, of information that's licensed by the media, governments in a way, good journalism that you think people ought to know about, say, education or food security, but how do you get people to read it, engage in it? It's not just about putting the information there, it's also about the shoe leather reporting, making it interesting, informative, and, I'd like to know more about that. And the idea of citizenship, because I think we've been having this idea of, what it means to be a citizen in the age of platforms. Yeah. And I think that's something that could go into this almost as a kind of call to arms, like this is an opportunity to define what it means, what we as citizens of these countries want out of the media, and, instead of the language of human rights, which can be, it can be some governments can just say, well, this is going to be yet another stick to beat us with. But if you talk to your citizens rather than talk to them in the framing of human rights, you might have access to governments like, I'm just thinking, governments like Singapore, for example.
Yeah.
Which will accept,
so digital citizenship. And
yes, they'll accept the idea of digital citizenship, less so human rights.
Yeah, an interesting point. Did you want to say something in response to that, or we'll move to a question?
Well, I just give one, I think they're great points. Just one concern is that the discourse of citizenship can often be co-opted into national citizenship, and then young people are not included because they're not legal age citizens, and of course migrants and refugees are not included. So we need to be a bit, depending how you define it. Yeah.
Yeah, good points. Anybody else have a question or a comment? Yep. And then I'm going to ask you, Guy, to just summarise your key takeaways just to wrap up.
Okay.
Or key takeaway.
What kind of role do you have for opinion in putting this together? I get the sense that when people talk about journalism, we're talking about reporting, but there is a big space that opinion journalists occupy. And I think it's something to celebrate now. We're looking at the continuum of opinion. We can bring in the voices of bloggers and so on and so forth. I'm just wondering, in this set of indicators you're putting together to come up with a map and so on and so forth, how is opinion shaping up?
You know, it's not, we haven't gone into that detail, but broadly, I think at UNESCO, the view is that journalism includes verified information in the public interest, okay, news, and informed comment, because anybody can comment, but journalistic comment should be informed comment, and also in the public interest. So it's a broad thing. Now, journalistic comment can be done by many actors, but it's thoughtful comment. It's not just kind of, I like this or I don't like that.
I disagree with you. Full stop.
It should be based on some journalistic methods of actually, comment based on evidence, based on verifiable evidence, comment based on international standards, comment that deals with public interest issues. That's, I think, what distinguishes journalistic comment. Whether it's done by bloggers or a Facebook post, that's not the issue. But it's just different to the kind of knee-jerk instant response of, a Vox poll.
It's probably worth noting that, I mean, UNESCO and other UN agencies don't necessarily define what a journalist is, but what an act of journalism is effectively. So what is journalism, which does incorporate journalistic acts done by a range of different people. Yeah. So Guy, if you could just share with us perhaps one or two of your top-of-mind takeaways from this session. What stood out for you?
Well, I really appreciate the very concrete comments of people from, speaking right from their, where they are, and it's very sobering because in the UN, it's, we operate at this high level of international kind of standards and so on, and you hear from people on the ground what's it like in Egypt and Philippines and the CNN experiences and what Raju was saying and coming also from Wikipedia. So getting that concrete stuff, I think, is really, it's sobering but also very helpful because in the end, these indicators should be assessing exactly this kind of level of reality and coming out about ways in which different actors can improve according to their roles, their responsibilities, their possibilities. So I think this helped to root things in that experience. And again, I would just say that we're dealing with a very wide system, which is not just about information and communication. Now it's about commerce, it's about warfare, it's about all kinds of transportation and artificial. It's like a growing, complexifying ecosystem. And within this, still journalism is so important, and we've got to try and make sure that whatever we do vis-a-vis this ecosystem that's impacting on so many different dimensions, that journalism does get protected and respected and can play the kind of role that society needs, because really, without journalism, I mean, I think there's the idea of moving forward to achieve these great sustainable development goals. Societies will be moving in the dark, because it's only journalism that can really provide the kind of the light that's needed. Because everyone else is providing heat, but journalists should be providing the light.
Thanks. That's an inspiring comment on which to end the discussion. But just before I do close, this is a study that I did for UNESCO under Guy's leadership called The Protection of Journalism Sources in the Digital Age. I've got a few copies here, and I'm mentioning this because within it is a set of 11 indicators, if you like, around allowing the assessment of the protection of source confidentiality and, to an extent, whistleblowers within a state. So it's like a very mini version of the exercise that's underway here. And one of the recommendations, or one of the indicators, was around ensuring that journalists have the capability to deal with whistleblowers and confidential sources securely. As a response to that, in part, an NGO called Blueprint for Free Speech is working with OSF to try and develop guidelines for journalists working with whistleblowers. I'm on a panel this afternoon talking a bit about this with this man here. I think it's at 2 o'clock, and we're using a roundtable at UNESCO, at the International Journalism Festival here in Perugia, to try to get some traction around what these guidelines look like. So I think that gives you an example of what concrete action could ultimately emerge. So if anyone wants a copy of this, please come and take it, and it's free to download, I can't speak anymore, via the leaflet you have. Thanks so much for coming. It's a really important intervention, and I'm grateful for you being here. Thanks. Well done.
Thank you. Yeah.
need it. Yeah. Is it on?
Now? Okay.
Okay. Ah, there we go. Easy. We're all coping this morning. Thank you for coming. I know that it's Saturday and it's beautiful, so I feel that any time that we get from you when we're in here is a blessing. We're gonna try to keep it kind of casual this morning. Really want to keep it more conversational. We really want to have a lot of involvement from you guys as well. It's a small enough room. It's Saturday. We're all here to converse and hang out, but we're going to be talking about ethics of social news gathering. I'm here with Kim Bowie and Fergus Bell. I'll have each of us kind of give a brief kind of reason why we're here talking about this to you, and then we're going to jump right into it. Really just kind of talk about some of the big ethical issues that are facing us in social news gathering. This is how, if you want to tweet at us or something, this is where we are. So I'm Annie Jenkins. I'm the editor-in-chief at Storyful. I've been working in social news gathering for about 10 years, I guess. I guess that's a pretty long time. And I've really been seeing this evolve quite a bit over time, but these guys have been, I think between all of us, we have 50 years of experience, so it's great.
My name is Kim Bowie. I've been doing social news gathering for, I guess, about the same time, right? Somewhere around there. I was an early social media editor, and I spent some time at Reportedly doing verification and social storytelling work, and yeah.
I'm Fergus Bell, and I started doing this full time on the 25th of January 2011, which was the day of the first protests in Egypt.
Very
so
specific.
I remember that because that was the day that I started and didn't go back to my old job, so that's why I remember it. But we've also all been involved in creating an ethics code with the Online News Association as well. So that's why we care about ethics. And
well, we also care about ethics because we're good people.
Yeah.
But we'll just dive right in terms of some of the topic areas, and really we're going to try to kind of keep it to a few things that kind of come up a lot in social news gathering, and like I said, we really want to involve you guys, so I think, as we go along, if something comes up and you want to yell at us about something, we embrace that. We don't have to wait for the end. Cool. Well, one of the things that I know that we always stress, and when we wrote the ONA UGC ethics code, was one of the first things that we tackled was the fact that verified information and what that really means. We want to make sure we're obviously sharing information, that we're sharing user-generated content, eyewitness content that is verified, that we know everything about that. But it's not nearly as straightforward anymore as it used to be. I know Fergus, we were just talking about this last night, about even what verification means and kind of who is doing the verifying is now kind of a question.
yeah, so if you go and talk to any news organization or you talk to someone on the street and you ask them what verification means, I think everyone would have a different answer at the moment. There is no common standard amongst news organizations or even journalists. And I think one of the kind of evolving ethical issues around this is how we describe verification, especially, I say that but I'm against defining something like fake news because I don't think it can be defined, but verification, I really believe, can be defined. It doesn't just mean this is the person that captured it. It has to mean something like this is the person that captured it and this is actually what it's showing.
Yeah, the context is also really important.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people I get approached by a lot of technology companies who say, oh, our technology verifies this, our technology verifies that. Actually, it doesn't. It just tells you who was the person that captured it. And so for newsrooms and for journalists starting out in this world, it can look like there's solutions out there for this, but actually we're the solution still.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit like when you go to the grocery store and things are called natural, right? Like you can define natural so many different ways, but there should be a common standard, like organic, which is also kind of a fiddly word actually. But it's just people can use different, there are techniques that can get you toward verification, but not everyone does it the same way. So I think most of us that have been doing it for a while have like a checklist of things that we have checked. and that we know that that's true, but it's the how, and people tend to think the how means that it's verified. I don't know if that makes sense. Like, oh, I ran that through this program, so it's verified. Like, well, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. You don't know anything. You know that it was posted by that person, but you don't know what that person's motive was. There's all sorts of things that could happen, and there's ways to trick technology.
Well, and I think it's about the transparency of a verification process and for the audience to understand what that really means. And I would say that applies even outside of social news gathering. If we're saying this is how we know what we know and this is why what we know is important, and having the audience trust that. You know, if you have like a Perugia bingo card and we're talking about trust, that's that's your keyword for the day. But that's very much what comes at the heart of that too, is if we're talking about the process. I know at Storyful we have within every social news gathering piece that we're putting out every day, we have a very set list of information that we have to give, and that always has to be filled in for every single story. So that's, how do we know that this is the person that owns this? What is the context of how they captured this and what their role was in this situation? What was the time of this and how can we prove that it was on this date? You know, where did this happen? How can we prove that that's the case? Are there screenshots within maps and things like that? You know, we have lots of different pieces and parts that have to go into everything that goes out. And I think that anyone who's really doing social news gathering in an ethical manner has to have some kind of process built into what they're doing that the end user can sort of know what to expect if you're having that.
It's also an argument against automated verification in a way, because by showing you're working, you're able to increase trust, I think, in the process that you've done. If you rely on if you just feed something in and it spits it out at the other end and says it's verified, you definitely lose some of that transparency. I'd be really interested if there's anyone in the room that works for a news organization that has a defined verification process. A show of hands? No?
Ooh, no.
Or you just keep it all up here. Everybody's independent. I get it. It's helpful to write that down. I know that much. I think that that's been the best way to train new people in doing it. Anytime we bring someone into a newsroom is to really have a dedicated checklist of not only everything you should do when a story comes around, but knowing the expectations for how every story should go and what to look for, especially if it's breaking news and everything's crazy and you don't remember if you did this or that or that you communicated it.
It's also useful to show that to the public, right? So like not just for your own internal processes and knowing that the person who verified that thing 3 months ago did a good job, but it's also every time I have done like a thread or something about how I verified XYZ, it usually goes berserk. And I think that's because regulars, the general public, muggles do not necessarily understand how we verify things, and the more we show them how, I think that's helpful not only to us but to them, because my like sneaky goal in doing open verification is that I'm trying to teach people to be more media literate at the same time as like doing my job. So if I can show you how to reverse image search an image, then maybe next time your cousin's aunt does something, posts something on Facebook that's fake, you know how to prove to them that's wrong. You can win a lot more family arguments and be a better media consumer.
There was a panel yesterday about automated verification, and a few people have spoken to me about the threat of AI and bots. I am personally not so worried about this, because anyone that's been doing verification understands that it's not just verification is not just using a whole host of technical tools. It's about constructing a case for why something has been verified. And actually a lot of it isn't based on technical analysis. It's based on kind of the human analysis of things that are uploaded to social media. I think that's something that's not necessarily understood by a lot of people who consume news or who read about things that have been verified. And that's why talking about that process should hopefully, allow people to trust that it's not as big a threat as it might appear.
Yeah, like when I teach verification to students, I usually end up like saying, I need you to show me all of your work, because the likelihood is early on you will make an illogical conclusion based off of some evidence. They'll be like, oh, well, that tower in the background of that video in Syria looks like this tower. I'm like, well, that tower is actually a little different shade of blue, but you thought it was the same blue. If you zoom in, there are very small things that you can make a big jump, and then it just sets you on a different course and will put you in a different place.
And sorry, Mandy, I know we're probably talking over time about this, but
close.
Yeah.
There's no moderator for this panel, so it's just out of control. We're just trying to moderate each other.
I'm also a big advocate of us adding value and kind of respecting the abilities of the audience now. So a piece of content is not necessarily a story until we apply something to it, which is really important in terms of verification. That is something that we can do. But also, our audience, journalists and news organizations are not in that privileged position where we get access to an expensive wire story or an expensive breaking news alert. Our audiences have access to the same original data or original sources as we do in quite a lot of these cases, and they need to see that we know what we're doing with these sources. If they can find the original source, we need to show that we can find it and talk about that transparent verification process.
Right. I think we'll keep moving on to our next part of the topic, and if there's anything you want to come back to with questions, we certainly can do that. But something I know that has been very much, at least in the discussion of social news gathering, not only within the industry, but I think amongst readers and amongst audiences, has been that they're seeing the outreach of journalists to eyewitnesses and participants in news events, and not necessarily liking seeing behind the curtain to some extent of how news gathering is happening. There was the Parkland school shooting in Florida a couple of months ago. There were tons of journalists everywhere in the world reaching out to students who were inside the school, and there was so much visceral reaction from other people to seeing that happen. And I mean, this happens in every story, but for some reason I feel like that one really captured people's attention, and there was a lot of discussion around it. Granted, people could have been better about it, and I think we can get into some of the ways to be better about how we reach out to people who are in the middle of a news situation. But there was a really interesting report after the fact on ABC Australia on their Media Watch program, where they had said that outreach on social media by journalists is kind of the new door knocking. When you'd have to go and show up at someone's front door after a relative has been killed or arrested or something, that is part of the process that readers never have to see, and if they had to see it, they'd be disgusted by it, but it's an important part of the reporting process. So they compared that to kind of a modern door knocking, but now that people have to see that, which I thought was pretty interesting, because I think if there's a way to do it right, there's a way to do it well and to be respectful and to care about somebody's safety, but that it is increasingly a very important part of the reporting process when we're talking about social news gathering. I know you guys, we all have to do this, so we all know a little bit about it.
I think the difference between that the door knocking analogy is, I get, but it's not quite accurate, because it's like, instead of having one local reporter doing the door knock, you now have the world's press bashing down the door to see who can talk to the person first.
It's like if the paparazzi came to your house because your brother got in a car accident. It feels more like that.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think, too, you see things, I know that we were just talking yesterday when we were kind of putting this together, of saying that you see during these stories that not only is there just an influx of everyone coming to one or two people when they're having their worst day already, and then they have hundreds and hundreds of tweets replying to them from journalists, but you have multiples from the same news organization because there's nobody coordinating that. There's also nobody that seems to be asking the question of, A, do I need this now? Like, is it actually important that at this exact moment when somebody's hiding from a school shooter in their classroom that I'm bothering this child, who is actually a child, who's like 14 years old, to give me information? Can it wait until they're outside? But also, do I actually need this? Because, we see people who, like, I think one of the classics of this, I remember during the Paris terrorist attacks, there's a couple of eyewitnesses that are in the middle of things, and there were people working for like a local television station in Oklahoma reaching out to these guys. I'm like, do you specifically need to be the one that's doing this? Can't you get this from AP? Can't you wait? Like, you're subscribing to these services. Do you, as a local television reporter in the United States, need to be reaching out to somebody who is in the middle of a terrorist attack in France right now? Yeah. I would question that maybe that wasn't really a priority at that moment.
Yeah, my concern is that every local story is now an international story, right? So where something like when I started reporting ages ago, if you covered a local story, you would cover a local story and it would be local, and then maybe it would percolate up. But it feels like every single thing, like every school shooting, every terrorist attack, like I don't know why, like this TV station in Oklahoma needs to talk to that person. I can understand if that person is an Oklahoman, or has some link to that state, but it doesn't matter. And I think about this, that TV station is probably part of a parent company. It's probably like ABC, NBC, Fox. Why don't they just wait for their parent company to come out with that? Or why don't they subscribe to a service like Storyful where they're gonna get that for them and they don't have to go through that work? It's extra work when most of us don't have time.
And even those bigger organizations, I think there's this really strange thought that if you ask first, regardless of the situation that they're in, it's going to put you at the front of the line. And so I always think, well, okay, so you've messaged them 1 minute after they said they're scared for their life and they're hiding. Are they going to then just take out their little notebook and go, oh, well, that person asked me first, so I'm going to make a note out of it, and that will be the very first person that I go to as soon as I'm safe. I just don't think it's going to work like that. But we've also been talking about this for so long. Yeah. What's the solution?
Well, first of all, I do think one of the reasons why everybody piles on is because outreach is easy. It's hard to call somebody, it's hard to do reporting, but if sending a tweet to someone, anyone can do it. So it's the lazy way out. And I think that to some extent, having people sort of put a spotlight on outreach and on bad outreach, I'm not against shaming, I guess is what I'm saying. I'm not against shaming people who do it badly, because I think that it highlights for people that how you're supposed to be treating others. And to say, maybe this wasn't your time to be doing this, person who tweeted 1 minute afterward. We can wait for this. And I don't know, I guess, necessarily if there's a role for the platforms in this. I know that we've all been parts of various conversations over the years about how that might be mitigated in terms of either the platform somewhat when a new situation happens of seeing the one or two people who are kind of the original eyewitnesses and doing something in terms of, I don't know if it's like blocking or moderating or somewhat collecting those responses somewhere separate for them, because they might be in a situation where they're not safe, they can't respond anyway. They could do some sort of blanket communication if they wanted to, but I think that there is a potential technical solution to help with this, but again, it takes that competitive element out of it as well, because that would kill the competition for that if there were some mediator in between.
There's also some really common sense structures that can be implemented within newsrooms. I've seen examples of at least 3 different people from the same organization communicating with the same person that is hiding in a dangerous situation, and replicated across 3 or 4 other major organizations all at the same time. And that's just bad newsroom management, that you have multiple people communicating with someone who's in mortal danger. Mandy, you said you're not against shaming bad people. What is the worst group for this? Who are the main, not the individuals or the
organizations?
Like the type of organization or the region. Who's the worst, and why do you think that is?
American cable broadcasters.
You think American cable? I would say American local TV broadcasters.
Yeah, that also works.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I know that there was one organization. I'm trying to remember what story it was. It was some usually incredibly tragic mass shooting story, and I remember seeing the same cable broadcaster had 6 or 7 different journalists in the same thread, clearly not reading the replies or even reading that other people had reached out. They clearly all just like reply. I'm not even going to bother reading who else has reached out to this person, what their answers may have been, because that's another key for all of this, so to do this ethically, is when someone has tweeted something like that, look at how they've been replying to people, because if they're replying, for one thing, they're probably safe, so that's great. They might be giving, and they might be telling people, yeah, sure, you can use my photo, or this is what I know. Don't ask them again just because it was easy for you to hit reply and do that. I think that that's one element of it, is that they're not even bothering to look. I know in my newsroom, if I happen to see that multiple employees of mine have reached out on something, they are going to hear about that.
Someone's in trouble.
Someone's in trouble.
Yeah. I don't even think it's unethical. I think it's just lazy, shitty reporting, honestly. Like, who would go to, in real life, go up to someone's door and be like, so I don't know anything about this story and I don't know you, and then like be followed by their colleague and they knock on the door. It doesn't make sense to me. Like,
yeah, who here has enough journalists in their newsroom to send 5 people who don't know that each other are there to go report on the same person?
Yeah, it doesn't.
Does anyone have an embarrassment of riches of people in their newsroom?
and a like a wealth of time. No one has that. And it's just, look, you were just saying, Mandy, that it would just be easier if maybe the platforms could just like, you could broadcast, yeah, you can use it, or no, you can't. But the fact is, I see people doing that.
Right.
I see
They're trying to do that on their own.
Yeah, I see people like they'll post a video, they'll get like 1.5 billion replies, and then 2 minutes later they get so frustrated with it, they'll tweet again. They'll be like, anyone can use that thing, just stop bothering me. And then people keep asking, and I'm like, what is wrong with you?
They don't bother reading.
Yeah. The worst example I have seen of something like this is actually during the massacre of British tourists in
Tunisia?
Yes.
Yeah.
And this person says, I've got 3 photos. I witnessed it. I can't talk at the moment. And then he gets bombarded with messages saying, are you there? Do you have any photos? And then he even gave his phone number, and which is very rare to happen. But he said he couldn't talk at the moment, but he gave his phone number. So you've got that for later. A journalist, used a message to this person on Instagram to say, can you tell me the dialing code for Tunisia?
Are you kidding me?
I am not kidding. And it would have taken less effort to put that into Google, Tunisia dialing code. And it just makes us look so bad. But I also think there's some assumptions that journalists make or don't even think about. That if someone has shared something on social media during one of these situations, that they are broadcasting to the world. That is not the case. They are broadcasting it to their friends. It's often the quickest way to let their friends know about something. Also, you shouldn't assume, whenever I walk into a room, I don't turn my phone to silent, just in case something terrible happens and the world's press is going to try and get in touch with me. But what we're seeing now is people getting in touch with people who are hiding. Well, they don't have to respond to me. Yeah, but you're making their phone make a sound even. And maybe you didn't even think about that, but you should, because if you give the location away of someone who's hiding, that's an ethical question that you have to have asked yourself and that you have to be happy with for the sake of protectively getting that story for your regional bulletin in the Midwest US.
Leave the Midwesterners out of this.
Yeah, they're A-okay, man. No, I think it's also like, and what bothers me ethically is that one person can ruin it for the rest of us, right? So the instance I like to use is during the Pulse shooting. There was a young man who pretty much live tweeted the whole thing, and people just kept trying to get in touch with him. And his first tweet was like, I can't find my best friend, I'm not okay. And then a bunch of people like asked him, and he said, no, I don't want to. And he just routinely said no, and then he just posted, no, I don't want to talk to anybody right now, we can't find my best friend. We were hiding in the bathroom, I'm safe though. And then he posted again, I think we found my best friend, but he's in the ICU. And I don't know if he's going to make it. Keeps getting a request. And then the 4th one, he was like, my best friend died, and then keeps getting requests. And then the 5th one, he just takes some poor journalist, some person that's just honestly trying to do their job, quote tweets them, and basically just says like, you fucking vultures, I will never talk to any of you. So that it's just, that one person was the person that broke that person, and he never did any interviews as far as I can tell. He was very, very upset, and I could read how upset he was. Like, if my best friend were in the ICU and I couldn't find them, like, I would not want to talk to media.
So what's the solution? What's the actual solution here? Because we're not going to create a new initiative, but
no more initiatives.
No more initiatives. But I think that there needs to be some solid advice. Like, if you work for an organization that owns multiple titles, or that you have a consolidated newsroom, or you are an agency subscriber, or how do you limit the number of requests by working collaboratively within your own organization, not even a competitive issue.
Right. No, I think that has to be part of your process. You know, we had talked about the verification process. I think that they're as part of a news gathering process. I know for us, we have an internal system for logging our outreach. This is who reached out to this person. This is when they reached out to them. It's done. That's logged inside of Slack and in Trello, and everyone can come back and see that across our team. We're not going to have a second. Like maybe they'll do it later, like a day later, hours later, or something like that, if nothing happened, and if it's not a breaking news situation by that time. But not duplicating it and having a system for not duplicating it, I think that's one step to start limiting it by organization at least, or by giant company.
You should have some step. Even like when I was at Now This, and we were integrating verification in, we put down this blanket rule, like instead of having everybody look for footage and do things, we designated one person for the whole story. Like this person, that's their job is to get permissions. And if things have permission, they put it in a certain part of a Google Doc. And if someone said no, they put it in another part of a Google Doc. There's also there is tech that will help you with this. Like Check exists, the AP Social News Desk thing exists. There's bunches of technology you could, but we use a Google Doc. It's that
easy
hard.
enough.
Yeah. Or like we just said in Slack.
I screenshotted something the other day which I thought was terrible, because it's about outreach, and I mean maybe it's moving towards the permission side of things, but I can't remember what the story was, but a certain newspaper said, "Hi, could we use your image on this organization with credit, many thanks?" This person says, "No, you do not have my permission to use this image anywhere on your site or in print." And then everyone else who was following that thread then started posting the links to where they had used that video, that photo.
Gosh.
So this person had explicitly said no after being, and then they still used it.
Wow, that is a great seg into our next topic. It's like you set me up, because we're talking about clearance and permissions. So when we're actually conversing with this person, what happens if they don't give permission? I think that the question of how far fair use and fair dealing can go, I think that's something that a lot of news organizations fall back on in a breaking news situation. I can fair use this. It doesn't really matter. And they also don't necessarily care about the source. They don't care if they have the right person. They haven't necessarily done their homework on it. They think that fair use will cover everything. It's like, it'll cover you for now, for today, maybe, but if you didn't do your homework, you still might be wrong. People still could have a case, especially if they explicitly told you not to use something and then you did anyway. But I'm curious from you guys, how have you seen the evolution of the fair use question come in when we're talking about clearance?
It's just like when I took media law in college, in the U.S., right, fair use is an argument. It's not a rule. There's no law that dictates what you can fair use and what you can't. It is a legal argument that you can use in case you get sued. So like when we say, can we fair use this, what the real question that people are asking is,
will I get sued?
Yeah, do you think we'll get sued for this? And I would get people who have not thought about media law that are trying to get, they'll be like, well, I could probably fair use it. It's for a news story, so it's fine. I'm like, but that doesn't mean you can, legally, maybe. Legally you can do so much more, but ethically, I don't think so. Like, legally, that person, if that was in the U.S., could probably maybe be like, well, it was in the interest of a news story, blah blah blah. There might a very small argument, but there might be an argument. But ethically, that's not okay.
I've spoken to some. There was one example where I spoke to a very large news organization, and their policy was not to ask because then someone couldn't say no, and that's how they got around that. But I personally think.
See, that's legal, not ethical, though.
Yeah, I personally think that theft of content from an industry that only has its content and is fighting so hard for that to be respected and valued, I think it's disgusting for an industry who is focusing so much on that to steal people's content. And I don't really think there's an excuse for it, especially nowadays when people have the opportunity to monetize their own content. And that is their right. And saying, well, you know, we're going to publish it because it's important. A YouTube channel, you know, belonging to an individual often can have much greater viewership than a news organization. So, and if you are denying someone's right to someone's ability to make their own income off that content, then frankly, I think that's disgusting, and I think that it also erodes trust in the media. If we give people a bad experience and we take people's content, why on earth would they want to share with us? And why on earth would they respect, you know, our complaints about the value of our own content is decreasing?
It also makes a lot of assumptions. The way we do like permissions now is, I usually, like one of the very first things I learned when I was starting to do social news gathering was, I asked somebody, it was during some shooting in Los Angeles, and I asked somebody, like, can I use this photo? And they said, yeah, sure. And then I was like, okay, so where did you take it from? we're trying to figure out what happens. And he's like, oh, that's not mine. It's a friend of a friend's. They texted it to me. And I'm like, oh. And he's like, you can use it though. And I'm like, no, I can't. Like, you give me your friend of a friend's phone number so I can get explicit permission? Because that's like what I'm supposed to do. I think we're making assumptions that like the general public understands copyright laws. Yeah. And I mean, man, you can definitely speak to this, Mandy. Like, they do not.
No, I would say that almost the majority of you know, content we're working with in terms of social news gathering day to day at Storyful, the first instance that we see of it is not owned by that person. And they're not doing it because they're deliberately misleading anyone. They just think that they're passing along something really interesting. People want to be part of the conversation when there's a big story happening. They might not even know anyone or have any connection to it. They might share something that's not at all even related to that story. They just found it on Google, but they were like, this seems like this is a thing, and I want to talk about the news. And they're not out there trying to trick everyone. There are people that are out trying to trick everyone, but most of the people that we're encountering are just participants of social media who know that they're going to be part of this large discussion. And then when we do find the right person, for one thing, that's like the most important question that we can ask is, did you film this?
Did you take this?
Did you take this photo? And being very explicit about that, because for one thing, if you are even legally, you're trying to get into a licensing relationship or something like that, or any kind of financial relationship with an uploader, if you haven't asked that question, you're just throwing your money away because there's no way that's legally going to be upheld. And you know, something else too is that not only do they not understand copyright law necessarily the way that a journalist would, they don't know their own rights, which is why it's very easy for news organizations to take advantage of eyewitnesses. They don't know necessarily that they could be making money on something. Now, I'm not going to say that I want to encourage someone to be out selling horrific photos of a terrible news event, but people try to do things like fair use, really cool animal footage, or like really just interesting videos that they know full well that person could probably license and make money off of it. And they're just like, hey, can we use this? And not at all tell you what we mean by that. How long are we going to be able to use this for? What platforms is this on? Are you a distributor of content to other people? That they might not even know who they're giving it to or what the wide span of that is, and having that conversation is really important. It's that informed consent. It's not just asking and hoping to get a yes, but do they know what they're even saying yes to? Is definitely an ethical question that we have to make sure that we've answered as part of that process as well.
Asking for permission is a key part of the verification process as well, because you need to speak to, how can you do proper verification if you haven't spoken to the person that was there? I mean, that is something that, again, going back to the beginning when we talked about what does verified mean. How can you say something is verified if you haven't spoken to them or someone hasn't spoken to them on your behalf? And if you're a competitive journalist, you need to speak to them because you need to ask the most important question: did you take any other photos? Is there anything you didn't put on social media that we might be able to get? But I also wanted to, because I like to kind of try and make sure that there are some solutions out there. And don't quote me on this because I'm going to butcher the example, but in Sweden, there is actually a kind of insurance fund. So for the publishers, it could be part of the union or something, but there is this pot of money where if journalists have made every effort to reach out and get permission but haven't been able to, and then someone comes back and says, you took my photo, this pot of money is there to compensate those people after the event once they're found. So, I mean, that's a very Swedish way of doing it, but they've thought about that and they've implemented something in order to do that. So I think that they can say in the very, you know, we are doing this in good faith. We are reaching out to these people. If we can't get in touch with them, but we really need to use this for news, we have this insurance policy so that they will be compensated. I mean, I think that's pretty impressive, and I think that there are some lessons that need to be learned. Yeah, of course we shouldn't be having huge pots of money. We need to be careful, but we also shouldn't steal people's content.
And the other easy solution is to look at the language that you use when you ask for permission and you ask for rights to something. Like I think there's, you know, my example of saying, can I use this, or can we republish this? That's not a good question. But on the other end of that spectrum is a not good question, which I see a lot of places doing, which is like, hi, I'm just gonna pick a large broadcaster. It's not necessarily them, but hi, I'm from NBC. Can I use this photo and can we publish it on all of NBC sites and NBC Universal in perpetuity? And you clearly, you know a lawyer wrote that, right? You know some lawyer somewhere was like, anytime you guys ask for permission, you gotta copy paste this legalese and then have people, you know, tweet back with like hashtag NBC yes. That's horrible. That's the other end of horrible. Like I know why you're doing that. I know that it's making your legal team happy, but there's a middle ground in there where like you're telling them what they're agreeing to, right? You're telling them like, okay, can we use this just so you know it'll be used on all of the NBC sites, and I hope that, and on TV, and I hope that's okay with you. Like, why can't you just say that?
I've seen an example where someone has said, can we use it across any known sites in the universe? Now,
broadcasting live in Mars.
Yeah, and on platform. I mean, it's now becoming increasingly common to say on platforms, current platforms, and any platforms created in the future, which is an interesting thing, because if you get permission to use it on, you know, can we put this on social media, or can we put this on Facebook? What happens if you get that permission? Fine, but what happens in 2 years' time when there's a new platform that you haven't got permission to put it on? How do you get around that? And that's why, so that legalese can be intimidating. I think Storyful has some good ways of not getting around it, but making it less intimidating.
Right. Yeah.
But it's necessary, because if you're going to get the rights to it, you need to be able to use it in the future as well.
Yeah, we have our clearance rights and an explanation of someone's rights all at a link, and it's written in like, we try to make it as in layman terms as possible that we can get our lawyers to agree to. But also lots of translations, because all outreach is usually done in English, which is also ridiculous when we're trying to reach out to someone who may not speak English. So having all of that translated as well across different languages by native speakers, so it doesn't just sound like it ran through Google Translate and also reads like a crazy person wrote it. We want to make sure that they understand their rights. And as a content licensing agency as well, we don't license and pay for everything, but that is a part of our business in helping people monetize their content. You know, that is an onerous process, and it should be, because there's someone signing over their rights. That's a financial relationship. We have signed contracts with these guys. We have, you know, we're setting up accounts with them at PayPal, and we're having extensive phone conversations with someone that owns that, so to answer any questions they have about their rights, about how it will be used, how they're going to be paid, because we wouldn't want to go into a relationship where we're, you know, managing someone's rights for them without them understanding what they're really getting into. That's a relationship, and that's not only trust in terms of the newsroom clients we work with, but we want to build a relationship based on trust with uploaders, so they can feel like they're not being taken advantage of along the way too. And it's something that drives me crazy is working in the world of licensing and in clearance is when I see news sites go in and offer someone, you know, we'll pay you $2,000 for exclusive rights to this video that is a critical part of news gathering around a breaking news story. Like, did you need exclusive access? I mean, this is an important element of this story. Like, more newsrooms should have access to it, and you just paid up front what's essentially hush money so that no other newsroom can possibly use this. Like, I wouldn't know if it's an ethical question so much as just a shitty journalist question. But, you know, I don't think that that question gets asked enough in a newsroom. Like, should we have just, shelled out $2,000, $5,000? You know, how questionable is it that someone who put themselves at risk just got rewarded for that, or that they just sold a photo or a video of one of their friends dying to a network to exclusively have access to it, and no one else can even report on it now?
To play devil's advocate for a second, what happens if a news organization spent $2,000 sending a reporter or a videographer to a story that no one else covered, and they got the key shot?
Well, in that case, they did the work.
Okay, they paid the money because maybe the others didn't want to invest in covering that story.
Right.
So.
Yeah, but then other people would write about that story too. I mean, you know, that's aggregation. Yeah, but I mean, if someone says you literally cannot show, broadcast, put this anywhere on your site because we bought exclusive rights to it from an uploader who didn't know what they were selling, most likely. I think that's a different question.
Exclusive rights is.
Right, yeah. And I mean, it's one thing to do that with, say, you know, an interesting viral video or something, but doing that in the course of a breaking news story cuts off the public's access to it as well. Because often they ask them to take it down when that happens too. They're like, we don't want you to have this on your platform anymore either. We bought the exclusive rights to that and nobody else can use it. So, anyway, I can go about this one all day, but we'll keep going. Something that we talked about a little bit in some of the sessions of yesterday about the automated verification, but also has kind of become, I think, the fastest changing element of social news gathering these days is how we're reporting within online communities. So that could be like Reddit, 4chan, Gab, apparently the alt-right, wherever the alt-right hangs out. And also, you know, closed networks, things like WhatsApp groups, Facebook groups, you know, where people are actually interacting these days. You know, it dovetails well with permissions and outreach because so many people have flocked to these apps because of the bad behavior of everyone, but also journalists on the public platform. So they want to go somewhere private to talk to their friends, to people who they, you know, share interests with. And we still want to talk to them. News still happens there. Lots of news is happening there these days. And it's not only a technical challenge to get into those groups, but I mean, definitely an ethical question as to how you as a journalist should be interacting in that space. I know, Kim, you've got some experience with this too, in terms of the social news gathering part, you know, how have you been approaching that?
I use closed networks. I don't try to report. Like if someone invites me to a group or something on WhatsApp, I try not to report based off of that, unless I'm very explicit in the beginning. I am a journalist. I want to talk to some people. So occasionally when I do when I go into a subreddit that I don't normally post in, because I do post on Reddit as a regular human, but when I go into a Reddit that I don't normally post in and I'm doing reporting work, I'll say, hi, and I'll use my full name. I'll say, I'm reporting for, I'm looking for some people. Mods, you can delete this if necessary. Because I go in with the feeling like I try to be as humble as possible about that because it's their space, it's not my space. And I'm just like stomping on in, so I try to say like, if I'm not supposed to be here, it's okay. And most of the time, the moderators of the subreddits are fine with it, and a lot of the times, the people who are running the WhatsApp groups are fine with it, but I think that transparency up front is important to say like, I'm a reporter and...
But this is nothing new in terms of ethical standards for reporting. I mean, most organizations have standards for undercover reporting, for how you can do that, when you can do that, what you can report on in kind of public forums and stuff like that. Yeah. And clearly identifying yourself. It seems so strange that people would forget to apply those same standards to this world.
It's because it's digital. I think there's still this like weird thing where like, well, it's just on the internet, so it's who needs the ethics here, right. And that's not necessarily like. It's odd that I have to remind people when I talk to them about this kind of stuff that like what I do as a social reporter is pretty much reporting. And like everyone treats it like this magical, amazing thing.
Yeah, this weird niche.
Yeah, like I've cracked some sort of code. Look, I just report, but I sometimes do it on Twitter. Like, you know, instead of walking to someone's door, I just DM them. And it's the same thing. It's the same ethics. It's the same process. I haven't changed any of that.
Yeah, no, and I think too, there are a lot of approach for that for journalists as well. I don't want to identify myself or jump into this Facebook group and have everyone know I'm a journalist because they won't like me or they won't let me in. It's like, well, yeah, because they know that you're probably trying to sneak in the back door. That's like sneaking into somebody's birthday party and then secretly reporting from there. Like, that's pretty much the same thing if you're trying to lie your way into a Facebook group, or you're hanging out within various online forums, even being open forums, and you're planning to actively report on things that people are saying. And there is a different standard for journalists versus the users of these platforms. It's fine for someone to be on Reddit with, their whatever crazy Reddit name they have, or on 4chan and be anonymous. I mean, that's the community. But again, it's not our community. We have to play by the community's rules, but we also have to play by our own ethical standards and our own rules as journalists under a code of ethics that says we're not going to go in there and mislead anyone into thinking that we're someone that we're not. And that's, maybe it's not fair, per se, that we have to use our real names, for instance, and the users don't, but that's just how it is.
I don't know why it's unfair. Like, why anyone would see it's unfair. Like, you signed up to be a journalist. Sorry, you signed up. You signed up for people to maybe not like you, because they had. I've been working on this research project about empathy for the American Press Institute, and in doing this research, it's just like I keep asking people who are very good at empathetic reporting, who are very good at working with communities. I'm like, if you're going into a maligned community, a community that does not deal well with media or has a bad history with media, mistrust, what do you, like, how do you employ empathy? And almost, like, to a T, almost every single one of them, from editors to Pulitzer Prize winners, have said, I just go in there knowing that I don't know anything, and knowing that this is their space, this is their house, this is whatever it is. And I do as much research as I can beforehand, but I understand that research does not mean I live that life. So if I live in South LA, so if I go in and do some reporting on South LA, I'm not going to be like, oh, I grew up, I live in the hood, so I must know everything about growing up in the hood. That's not true. I know a little bit about it, but I don't understand. And I'm talking to you, I want to come into this Facebook group, I want to talk to these people, because I want to understand. And I have some questions and I have some thoughts, and I would like you to help educate me. I think that's the best way you can go into any sort of network like that.
Right. Yeah. It's about being honest within the space. Yeah. Got one more before we'll kind of go to questions, because this one I think we can be kind of quick on. But talking about the live video and live tweeting, live reporting, which feels like this was kind of the original social news gathering, was live tweeting everything. I think a lot of us have kind of pulled back since then. We've seen some of the worst of live tweeting in years past, but it still happens in the sense of, we want to be able to use technology to show our audiences what's happening, but what are the limitations of that? Are we hurting an active police situation by doing this? Are we creating an unsafe situation by being a part of that? I haven't had to do very much of this lately, but I know that you guys definitely had done quite a bit when you were at Now This recently, and I know that you've had to participate in the space a bit more.
Well, the thing about live stuff is it comes back to this like race to the bottom to be first thing. I like live tweeting and live video, especially like hosted live video from like a tense scene or like protest or something like that. I feel like it's very easy for rumors to fly, and then we don't often take the time to correct them. So what was it, the YouTube shooting? We were talking about this yesterday. With the YouTube shooting, I'm not with Now This anymore, and I was looking at I was following that story just as a consumer, and oh my gosh, there was some really just not great live reporting from that. Like, I saw journalists that I like heavily respect that do really good work, live tweeting stuff that is not true, and they had not confirmed. I saw somebody, and I won't out the specific person, but I saw somebody take a screenshot of a WhatsApp group and say that was between them and some friends, and somebody worked at YouTube, and he said, "Oh, I think I saw the guy. It was a guy, and he was in a full vest and gear. It was really scary." That none of that was true. None of that was true, and that person later was like, "I didn't even think about it. I posted, like, that person didn't even want me to post that. That was a personal conversation, and it wasn't true." And I'm like, why did all that fly out the window? Because you wanted to be first. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter
And again,
anymore.
that's a value add as well. You know, back to what Fergus said earlier, like what value do you add to a story in doing live tweeting if you don't actually know what you're talking about? All you're doing is creating more noise.
Yeah.
I think I'd like to just pivot to live video for a second. I worked at the very beginning of Syria coverage, really, and we worked with live user-generated content. And we had to learn a lot of things about that very quickly because we were working with people who were live streaming from rooftops. And very quickly we had to work out, well, actually, we need to work out where this is. But if we could work it out very quickly, then someone else who wanted to stop that live stream could work it out very quickly, and that's what they ended up doing. And the people who were doing it would eventually just set up remote cameras and kind of start the stream when they weren't there. But so many times we caught the shelling of the cameras. And that was a long time ago now. That was quite a few years ago. And I'm not sure that people have learned. People who are now working in other countries where it's not a war situation, but there are similarly dangerous situations, there are so many lessons that could have been learned from that haven't been. And that seems quite, I don't know why, maybe because Syria is a very faraway place and people can't see the similarities. But that was really something that struck me and stays with me. Also, live video is much easier to verify. I personally believe, because it's quite difficult to manipulate something that's live, especially when you know a situation's going on. And so it can be really, you can really want to use that content, but again, people are familiar with live content because they've seen it live on TV. But that is so different to using for a broadcaster to use it when they have a 5-second delay on it, a control room that can kill it if something happens, versus the ability to embed live UGC on a site with no kill switch, where your audience can see everything that's going to happen.
Right. Yeah, they might be seeing somebody die in real time on your website. Is that really something that you want to be showing to people?
Yeah, I also think, like, back to Syria and protests, I don't know that people that create UGC live video really understand the state of press freedom and how dangerous it really can be. And we perpetuate that by sharing things and sharing things because it's interesting. You know, like I will see people that are in other countries where there's not great press freedom, or you know, somewhere where there's a lockdown, and I'm like, I think they're going to get arrested if I repost this to my very large following.
But a lot of the reason they did live video and why live video was so important in Syria was because it was then stored instantly in the cloud, and it wasn't on their devices.
No, that's an argument to use it, but it's like, at least for me, it's like, I know the risk that they're taking. Do they know the risk that they're taking doing that? Yeah. And am I ignoring the fact that they don't know the risk of doing that by rebroadcasting that live or like sharing that live? There's a difference between like me watching it as a journalist, taking notes and writing a story about it, and then me sharing it with the millions of people and putting that person at further risk.
I completely agree, and I remember an example from outside the Pulse nightclub as well, people streaming live, and you have the ability, everyone has the ability to go live, but they don't necessarily have the experience in going live in a news situation. And I don't mean that to be patronizing to the people who do it, but there are decisions that go into where it's safe to set up a live shot, especially in a situation where people are being trapped inside a building. You don't necessarily make the decision to film live because what will the person inside do if they realize there's a live shot on them? Will they want to stop it? Will they act up for the camera? Will they potentially try and harm the person who's filming live? With no backup of a news organization or safety training or experience, I think it's an incredibly dangerous situation. And by showing that might have really fast breaking news value to us can sometimes be irresponsible, especially when it quite often doesn't have value in that context.
Should we take some questions?
Yes, I think it's a good time to take some questions on that. Yeah, I know we've been up here chattering around, but I'm sure you guys have questions here. Who wants to go first? All right.
There's a mic coming to you for the live stream.
I think
that the powers that be will insist that we have microphones.
Hi, I'm a college journalism professor from Miami University of Ohio, USA.
Ohio.
Yeah. My question actually goes back to your first points about verifying. It's a constant question I get from students. How do you verify something you found on Facebook, on Twitter, on Snapchat, that person is real? And I'd really like to know what's really on your checklist. You talked about calling or contacting the person, but what else is on your checklist?
I know for us, the kinds of things that we're looking into is really trying to paint a picture of who is this person and what's their connection to the story and what can I find out about them online based on that. You know, what's their posting history? What do they usually talk about? Where are they usually posting from? Who do they talk to? You know, those are signs of not only just to be creepy, and it is creepy, but it's also about figuring out if they're a real person and what their relationship is to the story in terms of digging in to see where they fit in, and also what other platforms they're on, because it may be that I found them on Twitter, but the best way for me to reach them is on Facebook Messenger or through YouTube or Instagram, that they may be more prolific on another platform, and that might be a better place for me to reach out to them or to have a conversation with them or to find a phone number for them. So it's really about putting together almost a quick social background on who this person is as part of the verification process. Like, yeah, I know that the photo or video is not necessarily about them, but as the source, they're the most important part of it. I know you guys might have other things you do.
The two things I usually stress that there's three things. There's who is this person? The date, is the date right? Is the weather right for the date? Is it the right time of day? Are their shadows correct? There's lots of guides out there for this, or one of us can send you one of our guides. And then the third thing I usually look is location. So is that thing shot where, or taken a photo of where it is? And for that I usually use background. You know, like, does the horizon look the same? Does it look like it's from a building, from down low?
You see street signs.
Street signs. The best thing about the U.S. is that we label freaking everything in the U.S., like everything. In other countries, that is not the same. Like, doing stuff in Syria, it's very difficult to verify because a lot of Syria looks very similar. Like, I almost always just, you look at the mosques in the background, and even then, it's really hard.
Most of my verification is done on the social history side of it, so how something has appeared, looking into their posting history. But if you Google any one of our names in verification process, you will see one of our many write-ups on the exact process that we implement, because we can share afterwards.
We could go on
as well.
all day about it.
we all do trainings regularly.
Yeah.
So. Other questions? Yeah, over here.
Hi, my name is Maaike. I'm a student from Holland, and I was wondering, because we were talking about, you know, the explosion of outreach and people who are almost journalists who are almost forgetting ethics because they want their story to be out first. It's almost a clicks competition, right? If I have it first, then maybe my story will go around the world, and maybe I will make some more money, or maybe my newsroom will be more known. How can we stop that? Because everybody is doing it. Everybody thinks we need to be the ones that make this news, that are interviewing these people to be more known. So how do we stop this? How do we stop this? Click competition, yeah.
Oh, I wish I knew how to stop this, because it's been going on long before we had the internet. But I think the more that people could realize, and I wish there were more case studies that newsrooms would kind of come out and be honest about as to the difference in performance of sites of stories they were first on versus the ones they weren't, because anyone who pays attention to the audience knows that the audience does not care who was first. It's going to be the best story, the most interesting story, what tells them the most. It might just be that someone wrote a better headline and they were better at their search engine optimization. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why something could perform better. It's not necessarily because they were first.
We've been giving this signal to wrap up.
I know.
Yeah. I think that, very quickly, the only thing I would add to that is maybe in newsrooms, when we verify and look for information, we'll be like, oh, that's fake, and we'll just throw it away. Again, this goes back to my sneaky thing. Try to educate people as much as possible. If you find a fake thing, tweet about it. Show people it's fake, tell people why it's fake, show your readers why it's fake. If you messed up on something, write a column about it. Talk about how you messed up, how other people could avoid this mistake. I think if we set ourselves up as examples, then other people hopefully will latch on.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, guys. Sorry, we'll have to grab afterward. We're getting all the wrap-up signs here. So, or can we get one more question in? Are we allowed? Is that okay?
No.
He's
okay. I'm getting mixed signals.
Wait, no,
here.
he's got a very quick question.
Okay, one more.
Arthur from Digital Communication Network. You mentioned that you incentivize some of the, actually, this is your business model,
right?
To pay the ones who are giving you footage. But what are the ways to incentivize people giving opinions about stuff or expressing their expertise, comments on issues, on news? Do you have an experience with that?
For us, we're often highlighting people who have, or whether not necessarily insights, because opinions are, I don't know, I feel like everybody has one. It's not necessarily always great, but I think the best way that any newsroom could be, elevating the best work that someone is doing is to be featuring that work and crediting it properly, elevating that and bringing that into the conversation. I mean, I know you guys might have more experience with that than I do because we're working so much with content. But
yeah, I think if you want an audience opinions, or you want to solicit more opinions of not just experts or interesting people, that there's things like Harkin is doing really good work of ask specific questions and to people and then try to get a lot of answers back. I think that's the best way to start, and then you can very clearly see who. And
elevating the constructive ones.
Yeah, elevate what's best.
Yeah. Is that it?
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was fun. We should do that all the time.
And one way to protect them is to share their stories and to pick them up and continue them as soon as you can, preferably before they die. You can't kill a story by killing a journalist.
Membership Puzzle Project is a research project at New York University. You join the cause because you believe in the work. And people who join the cause because they believe in the work are more likely to be loyal, which creates a stronger bond between supporters and journalists.
One of the founders of the movement of Families for Freedom. So we just wanted to make a campaign for demanding the rights of the detainees and their families, and to focus on the rights to know. I feel love all the time. I feel love even to my enemy. Nobody teach them how to love, so maybe I'm responsible.
Today, the journalism industry faces many challenges. So we're introducing the Google News Initiative, our effort to enable journalism to thrive in a digital age. It will enable new models for sustainable journalism, elevate quality journalism, and ensure that technology allows journalists to do their jobs even better. Because when journalism succeeds, we all do.
Il nostro pianeta ha bisogno di un nuovo modello energetico e noi stiamo già facendo la nostra parte. Abbiamo ridotto le emissioni di CO2 nei nostri processi produttivi, trasformato raffinerie in bioraffinerie e il gas che produciamo in eccesso in elettricità. Usiamo energia rinnovabile nei nostri impianti e continuiamo la ricerca sul solare. Il nostro lavoro è produrre energia, il nostro dovere è farlo sempre meglio. Abbiamo l'energia per vederlo, abbiamo l'energia per farlo.
Journalists need to be protected, and one way to protect them is to share their stories and to pick them up and continue them as soon as you can, preferably before they die. You can't kill a story by killing a journalist.
Membership Puzzle Project is a research project at New York University. You join the cause because you believe in the work. And people who join the cause because they believe in the work are more likely to be loyal, which creates a stronger bond between supporters and journalists.
One of the founders of the movement of Families for Freedom. So we just wanted to make a campaign for demanding the rights of the detainees and their families and to focus on the rights to know. I feel love all the time. I feel love even to my enemy. Nobody teach them how to love, so maybe I'm responsible.
Today, the journalism industry faces many challenges. So we're introducing the Google News Initiative, our effort to enable journalism to thrive in a digital age. It will enable new models for sustainable journalism, elevate quality journalism, and ensure that technology allows journalists to do their jobs even better. Because when journalism succeeds, we all do.
Il nostro pianeta.
La sessione all'ingresso per... mi sentite? Sì. Ovviamente alla fine ci saranno le domande del pubblico e potete fare le vostre domande sia in inglese che in italiano, non c'è assolutamente problema. Well, we can start. Welcome everybody, thank you for being here. I'm Raffaella Menichini, I'm a journalist for La Repubblica, the Italian newspaper. I've been covering foreign news and women issues for a few years. In the last 2 years, I've been the social media manager of La Repubblica, and I'm very honored and glad to be here with this amazing panel of women. As you noticed, at this point of the festival, we're almost at the end of the festival, there have been a lot of panels about women issues made of women, but also about everything else, panels of women, which is quite outstanding. I must say, after many years of being in this festival, this is the first year that I see so many women speaking about journalism, and it's I'm personally very, very happy about it. So this is an additional reason for being happy to be here today. But the story we're telling today at this panel is quite different from the stories about women that you have been hearing at the festival so far. There's been a lot of panels about women's rights, women journalists, women on social media, and how to better tell their stories and their fights and the risks they take. But they're always women that have tools and means to be heard and to tell their stories in first person. The panel we have here today, the discussion we're having here today, is about women and their lot. Quite the majority of women in the developing countries that have no possibility, no options. Oh, grazie. The radio producers, thank you. That have no possibility to be heard. And they live in countries and in areas that are also difficult to reach. And so the work of journalists to tell their stories is also very difficult. So it's quite a privilege today to hear the stories from journalists and humanitarian operators that had the chance to go and research and talk and live with them. And also journalists that live in rural areas, like we'll hear shortly. I'm very grateful to IFAD for putting together these great panel of speakers. So a few words about IFAD. IFAD is the International Fund for Agricultural Development. Is a United Nations agency devoted to promote and sustain agriculture in developing countries. And the idea behind their work is to empower the local communities rather than parachuting aids from outside. So to create projects in a way that they can sustain themselves on the longer term. According to, sorry about that. According to IFAD statistics, I'll give you some number, women in rural areas in developing countries control less land than men, have limited access to inputs, to seeds, to credits, and less than 20% of landholders are women. And even if they make most of the income in their family, they don't have control over their money, they don't have control over how the house is managed, and they don't have the technical facility or the education to access communication tools. So it's very hard, if not impossible, impossible for them to be heard, but also to connect with each other. Still, their stories are the ones that need to be heard, and that's why we're here today, so I'm going to shut up and present our speakers. Next to me is Caroline Namara. Caroline is a radio journalist and a social worker in a remote rural area of Bushenyi in Western Uganda. And she works at Radio Bushenyi as a presenter in family, children, and farmers programs. And also she's, recently she supported a Farm Radio International project in her community, which is working with 40 different women's rural groups. Their interactive programs, and Caroline will tell us about it. And next to Caroline, we have Thien Lei Win from Thomson Reuters. And Thien is a food security correspondent for Thomson Reuters Foundation. And she's originally from Myanmar, and after living many years abroad, she returned to her country and launched and managed Myanmar Now, which is a bilingual news service. And next we have Megan Williams. Megan is from CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. She's a journalist and radio documentary producer. And she covers, from Italy, she covers migration issues. And also she's been traveling to Africa. And she covers Italy as well, and many other places in the world. And last but not least, Ilaria Firmian. She's Environmental and Climate Knowledge and Capacity Development Officer for IFAD. She works for IFAD. And she has supervised a number of projects on the field involving women in rural areas. And she will tell us about this project, how she hears about women's stories through the project. So I will start with Caroline. If you can tell us about your radio project, first how it works, and then the stories that you hear through the program.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning. I want first to bring to your attention that whatever you're feeding on, or whatever the nations are feeding on, is food being produced by rural women. And there are these rural women who are poor and hungry after spending all that energy. Farm Radio International implemented a project funded by IFAD, and how we did it is that we looked for 40 women groups all over the district. And what we did, we bought for them radios because we wanted women to listen to the information being aired out on the station. We bought them phones. You know, in developing countries, information can only be passed through radios, especially in rural areas, because they don't have TVs, they cannot access internet, so it's only radios. And mind you, rural women don't own radios, they are owned by husbands. And so what we did, we said, let's buy radios for those farmer groups. So I would have agricultural extension workers come to our station, pass on that information, and then groups, those farmer groups would sit together, listen to the program, and then discuss, then practice the knowledge onto their farms, and others would, discuss, get some issues. If they are not clear on certain issues, they use the phones to call on the station and to ask, I didn't understand this, how can I do this? And then another thing would facilitate the agriculture extension officers to go to the field, to meet the groups, to see what is happening, to get hands-on practice. the extension workers would say, do this, do this, do this. And from there, they would also work together like a group. Because you see, in Africa or in Uganda, they use labor-intensive technologies. They have hoes. It takes a long time to get an acre of land, to till an acre of land. So they would work with groups. Like today, we would go to Raffaella's field, we dig. Tomorrow, we go to Carol's place, we dig, so that they can, share the information and also see how to expand their fields. And another thing, it would help them also to bring out their issues, because they have issues, gender issues, they have health issues. So the program actually is helping them to bring out rural problems, challenges. Like I've told you, someone is using a hoe to plant beans. So this is a small hoe. It will take a very long time. And he's also trying to plant seeds. She uses her mouth, because you want to calculate how many beans will you put in the hole. So you're like, two. At times you put there 4, 6, and you see it will not work well. And then another thing, how about the pesticides that was applied on the beans? So, we were trying to bring together all that information. We bring the agriculture extension officers, teach all that. So that is how our program is working. But basically, it brings out voices for the rural women to say, their challenges, and also to help them develop or practice better on their farms.
But besides farming, there are also issues regarding you mentioned gender issues.
Yes.
So also their life in the community and their life in the family. Does it come out in the program?
Yeah, it comes well, because what we do, we encouraged those women groups to call on their husbands to also join the groups, so that when we are talking about gender issues, when we are telling them about value addition, because as we will see in Africa, or generally in rural women, women are producers and men are marketeers. You spend all your time, you produce a bag of beans, but it's a man to look for the market. It's a man to decide. So they, in order to bring them together, we emphasized men joining women groups, so that when we're working together, they also, there is that male involvement in the program.
And what's the impact on the community, the role of women? You see a change in that?
Yeah. So it is very much, so much has changed. Of course, with that information, knowledge got from the extension workers. Now women have improved their productivity, and now they are able to, to own the radios, as I've told you. At least they are able to listen to the programs, and then they put it into practice. And by the way, because now women are seen as productive, men are joining. They are happy because the harvests are very nice. Yeah.
So thank you very much, Caroline, and we want to hear more about it later in the second round.
Oh, okay, thank you.
And of course, if the other speakers have also questions about it. And I will go to Thin. Let's change continent, go to Asia. And you have been working in projects with rural women. Can you tell us about
examples of what you've seen?
Sure, thanks. And yeah, I could just sit here and listen to Caroline the whole hour. And before I start, actually, I'd just like to say thank you to a few men who are in this room. Thank you for coming for whatever reason that you are here, because sometimes when we have these discussions, I feel like we're preaching to the converted, and it's so hard to get men interested in women's issues, especially in rural women. So thank you, whoever you are. Yeah, so, you know, changing continents, talking about Asia, specifically Myanmar, where I'm from. Has anybody been to Myanmar? Birmania? No? Okay. So it's a small country in Southeast Asia next to Thailand, China, and also India. It's been a very closed country for a very long time because we've had a military dictatorship for almost half a century. So the stories about Myanmar has always been very black and white. It's always been about, you know, the military and the people, and focus has always been on cities. So I went back to Myanmar in 2015 to help set up a bilingual news agency, and then I took a sabbatical, a 9-month sabbatical, and me and a really good friend of mine, we started a little storytelling project called The Kite Tales. The whole idea was to try and break down the stereotypes about rural areas and rural women and Myanmar in general. And because, you know, when we write about rural women, it's so easy to feed into the stereotypes of rural women as helpless, rural women as not, you know, victims of the circumstances, you know, just victims of rape, trafficking, poverty. Yes, it is extremely tough. It is extremely, you know, they are marginalized, but they are also extremely resilient. And I think it is important to bring that point out, because otherwise, you know, they will always be seen as people that need handouts, and their voices will not be broadcast. You know, it will be somebody else speaking on their behalf. And we wanted, you know, like what Caroline has done, to speak to them. And I just want to give two, you know, examples, I guess, quick examples of about how resilient rural women can be. One is about this grandmother in this remote hills called the Naga Hills. It's in the west of Myanmar. It's bordering India. Extremely remote, extremely undeveloped, and the Nagas have this, you know, reputation as warriors, and they were known very long time ago as headhunters. Infrastructure is extremely poor. You know, they've only started getting electricity and running water a while ago, and we interview this old grandmother who at first glance would just be a poor woman from a rural community. But, you know, in the course of 2 hours of us sitting and talking, she told us how she used to be a tattoo artist and show all the tattoos on her body. She sang us a song about traditional Naga culture, you know, and she regaled us with the adventures that she's had in these hills. She was never allowed to go to school. She can't remember how old she is. She thinks she's about 100. We think she's in her 80s or 90s, but, you know, time is slightly irrelevant there. And, you know, while we were talking to her, I mean, the literacy rates in Myanmar nationally is quite high. They're about 80% or so, if I remember correctly. But the literacy rates in Naga is very low, and it's even lower for women. They're like 25% literacy rate. But for women, it's only 16%. It is shockingly low, partly because they were not allowed to go to school. So this grandmother, you know, has become a champion of women's education. She made sure her 2 granddaughters go to school. And her granddaughters were sitting while we were doing this interview, and they were like open-mouthed, listening to their grandmother. And afterwards, they turned around and said, "We never knew this was what grandma used to do. This was her life." Because, you know, and it was a lesson for us also that there are generation gaps, even among rural women. And there are stories that we need to help tell, you know, in as many creative ways as possible about what amazing lives they had, how resilient they are. To a different part of Myanmar, this was into the east, so bordering Thailand, we met this young woman called Iris. She had never left the town that she grew up in, a small town. But then at 21, she crossed the border illegally to Thailand to help set up an exiled women's rights organization. She literally dodged warring armies on different sides. There were quite a lot of, armed groups in the border area. She trekked for days in the jungle, just her and an older woman. And when she finally got to the border town in Thailand, bordering Myanmar, she sold recycled plastic bottles to raise funding for this women's rights organization. And then they did that for a couple of years, trying to detail women's issues from their home country, from this border town. And then she came back to Myanmar when the country started opening up. And she wanted to register and set up the organization in country because it was an exile organization. And she wasn't sure how to do it. And with her and a couple of women, they came up with this idea to organize a female-only football tournament. And their team won the championship. So they started chanting the name of the organization. And that's how the organization became well-known within their own community. So to go back to my first point, yes, there is marginalization, there is a lot of issues. You've heard from both Raffaella and Caroline about the difficulties women face. The discrimination is structural, but I think we also need to rethink our perceptions of rural women and how we feature them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, that was really interesting. It was like being in Myanmar and seeing these things with you. It was so vivid. So Megan has some recent stories to share with us. So she spent a lot of days on a boat with the rescue teams, the Aquarius boat, with rescue teams for migrants in the Mediterranean seas. And recently also she spent a week in Senegal, covering stories of rural women. So she can you tell us about these stories?
Yeah, I will. I just first of all want to say that as a journalist, and I've been a journalist now for about 25 years, I have come to the point where I am consciously a feminist journalist, and by that I mean feminism seeking out women's stories, telling women's stories, affects everything that I do with the story, from the story angle, from how I choose interviewees, from the time that I dedicate to the women and men that I interview, to what Thin talked about, portraying women as more than victims, especially, even women in the worst of circumstances, such as the women I interviewed on the Aquarius, who had been through human trafficking and sexual violence, and also addressing the inherent power imbalance in the interview process. I think about that, subtle ways that I can change the dynamic of me coming in there, the expert, the person who has the power, who has the access to all sorts of communication channels, and trying to give as much power, lend as much power, I should say, to the person that I'm interviewing. So yeah, I was on the Aquarius for about 16 days, and it's the migrant rescue ship that patrols the coast of Libya, saving these overcrowded rubber boats of migrants, and the teams on board are Médecins Sans Frontières and SOS Méditerranée. And most of the people rescued are men, about 70%. Most of them are young men from sub-Saharan Africa, but more and more women are coming. But despite that, I really chose to focus on women's stories, which I often do for a couple of different reasons. One is men are overrepresented in everything generally, and so if I can, I try and focus on stories that don't often get told. And then the other reason on the Aquarius that I chose to focus on women is their reasons for migration are different than men's reasons. I mean, people are fleeing war, men and women, and extreme poverty. But what has become clear to me over the years covering the migrant issue is that women leave places, almost all of them, in fact, all of them, for gender-related issues. Gender-related reasons. They're escaping forced marriages, they're escaping abuse, They're escaping loss of income after being abandoned by a husband or boyfriend. Rural women who lack economic power, lack choice, and so that often is what is the ultimate push for them to migrate. And you know, I think that's important. It's an important story to tell because gender and class is the thread that runs throughout the full migration story for women. It's the reason why they leave. It informs their reasons why they leave. It informs their migration experience in the sense that they're raped. They experience terrible sexual violence along the migration route, and then they get to Europe or their final destination, and they're very vulnerable of the same kind of exploitation that was the initial reason for them leaving. You know, as I mentioned, I focus on, in terms of my selection of interviewees, I do try and seek out women, and this can be challenging. I mean, it can be challenging here in Italy. I mean, in the Western world, we know that. And when I'm finished, I'll tell a quick story of something that happened to me here in Rome. But it's difficult often to find the same number of women to interview about a story as it is men, because men get more coverage in the media, period. So if you're looking for an expert, you're looking for someone to talk on something, you know, the names put forward to you by just out there or by institutions are largely still men. So it takes extra time to find female experts on issues. And the third issue I wanted to talk about is timing. Both time spent during interviews, which I'll get to in a second, but also the extra time that it takes, again, to seek out people who might not want to talk initially, and especially with rural women in Senegal, you know, they're not used to, they're not given a voice often. They're not given the space within their community, and their opinion is often not as valued as men's opinions. So it takes extra effort to say to the person, either your translator or whoever you're with, to say, you know, I'd like to talk to a woman, and to take the time to win her confidence if she's shy, if she's reticent to talk to you, and also perhaps to take her away from peering eyes and ears of other villagers, because maybe what she wants to tell you, she doesn't want to tell the whole village. So it's, again, the time to find people who are not proposed, and the time spent with that person, so she'll open up. And as Thin talked about, it's very important to move beyond the victimhood that is often the story that we easily fall into when we're telling stories of poverty or isolation or sexual violence, or marginalization, all of those things that affect women worldwide. And, you know, I just want to tell quickly 3 different instances where I felt I was able to do this by listening carefully and by going off script in a sense. And a story that I did years and years ago was with, just after I finished university, I was a volunteer in Swaziland teaching English for a year, and became friends with a 17-year-old, a pregnant 17-year-old, who then went on to have her baby. I went back 10 years, and she was a single mother struggling and had just found out that she was HIV positive. So it was a really depressing story to tell. But what I did with her, and I had the time to do this, is I spent a day with her, just hanging out with her, cooking with her, and I was able to include a lot of joyful scenes, you know, her cooking, frying up food in the kitchen and talking about how much she loved cooking. And, you know, I'm conscious of not just telling the negative part of women's lives when you're interviewing them. And in my recent trip to Senegal, I would ask women about these economic projects they had been involved in, how it had changed their lives. I was interested in sort of personal empowerment stories. Well, the women wanted to talk to me about their new competencies. They wanted to talk to me about technology and how they'd mastered it. And that was what they were proud of. So shifting my script to give the women the power to take hold of the narrative. And I'll just, one last quick thing, because I'm running out of time. During the interviews, again, time comes into this a little bit, trying to give women more time, but switching the power dynamic as much as I can, and again, letting them direct what it is that they think is important, and being open enough to let them direct their own story, and responsibly reflect that when I write it up.
Thank you very much, Megan. And I think that you're pointing also to a responsibility of finding new way to cover, which can be useful also in other areas, not only, try to find different angles and try to investigate all the layers that are involved when we go out as journalists to look at stories and not. You leave with an idea and you want to fill the gaps that you think you have, and then you find out that it's something completely different along the way. Thank you. So now we go on the field with Ilaria, and you can talk about what it means to work on the field, project with rural women, and spend more time there than probably all of us can do usually.
Yeah, no, sure. I was a bit worried in the beginning because I thought I don't have the journalist approach to. I mean, it's a bit different, my approach in this panel, but I realized while listening to the other speakers how much of what they say speak to development projects as such. Because, I mean, for someone like me who works on the ground, on the design and implementation of rural development projects, actually the type of challenges that there are, I mean, some those have been mentioned, and they mainly relate to the fact that the women we work with, they lack access to information, they lack access to resources, to knowledge. They have a huge workload, especially related to fetching water and fuel wood. They often don't have a voice in their community, and also I mean, they lack the decision-making power even in their household. And on the top of it, they cannot decide, for example, on their mobility, on their health. And these are all the factors that when we design or implement a project, we have to take into account. And at the same time, a development project, also because of the reason Raffaella just said, that it stays for a while in a community, is an opportunity to bring about a social and cultural change. So whenever a project finds a way to challenge the existing social norms and culture that are those that influence the distribution of power and resources, I think this is a big opportunity. And I'm thinking of some of the examples that Thin gave. And in the end, there are a project that can support women to facilitate them paying the fees for schools for their children, for their daughters in particular. So, yeah, so I think that development projects are really opportunities in the sense for rural women. And for this cultural change to happen, I mean, we know that culture is something that is not static, it's dynamic, but it's also difficult to challenge. And so the approach that IFAD tends to take when dealing with this issue is always we start from listening to women's voice. And we adopt a lot of participatory approaches in the design of the project. So we really try to listen to all the different gender groups, which means sometimes having separate discussions. And I mean, not often we know women may not be willing to talk in front of men. So it implies a lot of also of logistics, of time concerns, of having the right person in the field to do the right type of interviews with people. And we really think that it's very important to do a good analysis of the situation, of the context. And then on that basis, I mean, it's difficult to generalize because it's very, very context specific, the solution that the project provides. But normally, if we want the project to be gender transformative, this is a bit the development language now, we look at gender transformative projects, this has to happen through a combination of interventions that look on one side at providing access to women to technologies, to resources, to different things, but at the same time also at building social capital. Because I mentioned participatory approaches earlier on, but also in general building capacity, providing information and knowledge, and maybe facilitating the creation of groups of which women can be part. These are all factors that can build women's self-esteem and maybe provide opportunities for them to speak out. The radio example is a good one. Actually, the radio project is one of those funded by IFAD, so it's an example, a concrete example of how project works. And sometimes, I mean, there are examples. I was recently on a supervision mission in Mali where we actually started piloting biogas digesters to give women access to, I mean, instead of going and collect fuel, they just they use animal manure to produce biogas. And this generates a huge saving in time for women. And it's interesting. So for us, I mean, we came to that pretty much with an approach of saving natural resources, more from a climate perspective, and for reducing women's workload. But we realized that there is an ongoing change. For example, many women reported the fact that their husbands, now they start heating their water by themselves. Some of them are even cooking, which was something totally unexpected and really, I mean, weird in the community. So this is just a little example, but how specific, maybe technology or specific intervention can bring about this cultural change that we want the project to do.
That's the issue of the impact in the community of empowering women is very interesting, and also the reaction of men, no? So how important is, this is a question for all of you, how important is involve men? You mentioned that, Caroline, in this process, and but are there also dangers when men feel threatened by women being more powerful? Is there a double problem here?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, women in Uganda are very worried because there has been affirmative action towards women being educated. Girls are going to school, and we are worried. Men are saying women are being empowered. Who is going to marry these empowered women? They are very worried. So it's like when women are being empowered, socially, economically, then later men will go down. And yeah, there's something to worry. But as women, we are not worried because that's what we want. That's where we want to go. Yeah.
So it's something that needs to be done in a way. So it's also the generational. When you talk about education, there's a generational issue there too. That for younger girls, for the girls, it's there are more opportunities now, or there's an effort to give them more opportunity.
Yeah, girls are being. They have more opportunities to go to school, and. We are happy about that because, as we are saying, maybe this will reduce the rural women, because young girls are being married. They are early marriages because they are not educated. So we are like, if girls are encouraged to go to school, then maybe we shall reduce that. The challenges that rural women are facing. Because like my mother didn't go to school, she suffered. I grew up in a farming community, in a farming family, where I grew up seeing my mother suffering under the pressure of my father, doing all the work, taking care of the children, I mean, even grazing animals. Then our father would come once in a while, you see, to sell cows, to sell bananas. And so my mother used to tell us that you're going to school, please don't be like those like children who are coming from big families. Know your status. And that's why I think that's why I'm here, because I listened to her. And much as I'm still living in a rural community, yes, but I'm not a rural woman. I'm not being stepped on like my sisters in our community. So we are like, if girls are promoted, then we shall be able to reduce the challenges down.
That's very interesting. Anyone of you wants to jump on this?
I guess this is, I guess, perhaps something for the development actors, and I'm sure you're already thinking about it. One thing that I've noticed in communities that I've covered, men are more supportive if they are involved in the projects themselves, so it doesn't feel that they're not excluded, so they don't, and they're made to understand that this is not a zero-sum game. Doesn't mean that women gain and you lose. It's that women gain and you gain too. That's the biggest difference that my experience covering these communities shown is the ones that understands that are the ones where there is a much more where the development programs work, and there is this understanding that women needs all these support, and in communities where that is not understood, and when they feel excluded, they feel that power has been taken from them and that is being given to the woman, that loss of power. I think that's a very important thing to think about.
I would like, really on exactly this point, I would like to quote a IFAD project coordinator in Mauritania. We recently have the IFAD Gender Awards that are given yearly to the projects that perform based on gender issues. And of course, the question of men's resistance came up, and the guy said, there's not such a thing as men's resistance, it's just a lack of awareness. And I found it very interesting, especially coming from a man's perspective. And because he really said it's normally when you involve men in development processes, they really, it's so easy to see that gender-sensitive programming is something that goes beyond human rights and equity issues, but it's really a value issue too. And whenever, we always to get better value and better development outcomes when we invest in women. And this is something that men see. Especially, if we need a bit of time, it's like I was saying before on cultural changes, we need time, but this is something that is evident, it comes up and men see this. So yeah, it's important, and of course in the development world, more and more we work using methodologies that do not look only at the community, but even sometimes they go more into the household and try to facilitate change dynamics within the households, for example. This is an approach that we use more and more in IFAD, or also, as I was saying before, building women's group, creating leadership position. And one thing that is also interesting for a development project is that normally you are able, over the course of the project lifetime, to identify role models. And they play an important role in small communities. I think Caroline has a lot of example in that sense, also on those who start speaking at the radio, and then more people follow. And whenever there are men who play a role which is more open to women's empowerment and so on, then it's always a good starting point. So we try within our project when we have situations like that to promote them. Yeah.
So I have one last question before opening to the floor. So if you have questions, have them ready soon. And it's about the challenge of coverage, because we're mentioning a lot the word time, and there's also the word resources, and these are two things that journalists don't have currently, don't have much. But, so is this a problem, and how can we overcome it? How can we deal with it?
Yeah, it's a huge problem. You know, especially if you're doing a quicker news story where you have to file, you know, a boat. In my case, it was a mass drowning of migrants. Go and interview some of the people who survived and file right away. I don't know. You know, the only thing that I try and do to compensate for lack of time, because you know you have to cover the nuts and bolts of who the person is, what his or her story is, all that sort of stuff in a short period of time, get their spelling of their name correct, their age, the village they came from, like all of that stuff, and that, you know, that takes a time in itself, and then get to their story. What I try and do is include what I call sort of dissonant elements in the interview, stuff that again, doesn't fit the narrative. I mean, I'm thinking when I was in Senegal, I was interviewing a woman farmer, and she was talking about the burden of feeding her family, and her husband had migrated years ago to Italy. And he had come back every so often, but he'd essentially been gone for 20 years, and so he sent money back, but she was the one who was looking after the kids and doing the farming, and so she was kind of telling me her story, and then at some point she sort of laughed, and so I said to the translator, you know, what did she say? And he said, oh, you know, she wishes she could be driving a truck in Italy. And, you know, it's just like a little detail, and it didn't really, you know, further the story in a way, but I include those things now because, again, it's a real live person who, and it caught her yearning for a larger life and for being left behind. And in a way that if I had focused on, you know, she has to harvest X number of onions every, you know, it just, so that's what I try to do, is just listen for those little things that are outside the box, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I guess in Reuters or Thomson Reuters Foundation, we call that color, you know, it's a journalism term as well, where we try to bring out the human person beyond just the statistics and the numbers, you know, just get a bit of color. One thing that I like to do if I'm in a rush and have to, you know, submit a story is try and get at least one or two personal details and colors. Sometimes, you know, like 99.9% of the time, I always end my interviews with anything else you'd like to add, anything else that you'd like to say, because then I am not asking the question, I'm giving them a chance for them to tell me what they want to tell me. And that can be very illuminating, because it has nothing to do with the interview that I've just done. It's something that they want to tell me. And I guess, you know, continuing with the victimhood and stereotypes and the time and the resources thing, you know, that's ever decreasing as we speak. And, you know, one of the things that I guess that can be done in a way, like what IFAD has done, was to bring somebody like Caroline, you know, here, so that we can, instead of us going, you know, we could hear what it is like, because it's becoming so much more difficult these days to go into the fields for journalists. It's, you know, journalism is being squeezed from all sides and angles, and I feel extremely fortunate to still be able to do the stories in the field when it should be done. But if not, I think there's a role that development actors like IFAD and other agencies to play, to, you know, bring the journalists to the people, or bring some of the people to the journalists. Obviously, there's a fine line in terms of, you know, how do we still keep it ethical? How do we still keep it journalistic? Because one of my biggest concerns is that journalism is becoming a profession only for the privileged. It's becoming so, journalists don't get paid very well. These days, internships and, job placements, you don't get paid at all. So unless you have somebody that can subsidize this job, you become, you give up journalism because you cannot make money out of it. What then happens is, or you don't have a master's degree anymore. You start having these paper qualifications that needed to become a journalist, become a very exclusive club. You go to the same type of school, you come from the same type of background, you start seeing things in exactly the same way, and you miss out on so many stories and nuances, and women's voices, especially rural women's voices, could be one of the things that will be sacrificed as a result.
Thank you very much. Any question?
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the whole panel for bringing out inspiring stories and a lot of points to think about. I have two questions. First, I have a question to Megan. So in your experience, how do you write the nuances between men in the Western world and in the rest of the world, where we see this rural empowerment and role of men and women, and how men support women and all those things? In the Western world, education, yes, greatly helps, but still there is one point, unconscious bias, and education helps everyone as adults to tame the wild, but sometimes some people, they don't tame their wild. So there is still tension in the Western world. It's just not being shown explicitly like in the other rural areas, for example in India or Africa or anywhere else. So how do you bring that nuance in your narrative as a Western journalist?
I just want to make sure I understand your question. Bring the nuance of what telling rural women's lives?
Yeah, it's in a way, how do you steer away from the stereotypes of rural men and women when you talk about gender issues as a Western journalist? Because as a Western journalist, you might have one experience in your part of the world, and you see a different experience, and how do you remove your pink glasses?
It's by trying to be aware constantly of my own internal bias as well. Like, it's there, and this idea of so-called objective journalism it's a fantasy, right? We're all people coming from our own personal experiences, telling stories the way we see them, and often the way that's been imposed. It's sort of the narrative has been shaped traditionally from our own culture. So certainly in the Western world and all different parts of the world, it's a white male narrative still. And so again, I try and focus on the competencies, like the empowering story, if it's there. But I was at another panel yesterday, and she said, don't censor, don't censor out the hardship and the violence and all that stuff, but tell the story in an empowering way as much as you can. And one thing that I've started to think about a lot too is just the dignity of the person. Like, if that were my daughter I'm writing about, or if that were a dear friend or my mother, would I feel comfortable portraying her that way? Just like personalizing it. And again, in this sort of objective journalistic model, maybe that's not kosher. Maybe, we're not supposed to do that, but I do it because, we all deserve dignity in our stories. And I think, okay, if she could read it, like oftentimes they can't read it or understand it, but if she could, would she feel comfortable with how she's portrayed? And if if I'm okay with my conscience on that, then that's the best I can do, right? Because I I'm failing in so many ways, always.
Thank you. And a quick second question to Thin and Carolyn. Because this session is being, in a way, supported by a group that supports farming and women in farming. How is the cultural evolution of women being landowners in your countries, and especially with climate change and a need for the role of women in climate mitigation? I observe, in my understanding, that land ownership given to women is really important. So, because I felt that both of you kind of touched these points, so I want to know a little bit more. How does this work in Uganda and Myanmar, for example? That's all.
Women owning land is still a big issue in Myanmar, not just in Myanmar, to be honest, the rest of the world, lots of parts of Asia. Part of it is, sometimes it's community, indigenous laws and practices that prevent women from owning it. Sometimes it's the government laws that put onus, administrative pressures on women to show that they own this, they own that, and it's still a big problem. There's a huge landlessness in Asia, in Myanmar as well, and women, tend to bear the brunt of it. There's still a lot more to be done, to be honest. Yeah, I mean, it's nowhere near where we would like it to be, and a lot of the IFAD, as well as so many other organizations. I know in Myanmar, they even have some of the legal aid groups that are essentially working with women, to become more literate in terms of legal terms. What documents do you need to show? Just a household registration form, or what else do you need to show to, to be able to start owning land and doing it? There are lots of projects going on, but I would just say we're still only at the very, very beginning of trying to actually give land to women. There's still a very long way to go.
Yeah, thank you. In Uganda, land is owned by men, and women lack land rights. So even if your man dies, strictly your children will own land, and that is legal. And there is a certain percentage when you lose a man, when you lose a husband, that a woman is supposed to get, and it is just a little percentage, like 1% over the land, and the rest is being shared by children. So legally, still women have a challenge in owning land. So that's why I was telling you that even if you put too much on the land, even if you invest too much, even if you build a land, house, or put a farm on that land, still you don't own that property. So still legally, I think the government has not supported women in getting land rights. You can imagine you're married to your husband for 30 years, 40 years, but if they are to divide the land, you just get 1%. So we still have that challenge in Uganda. And even culture is still stuck in their minds, because I think if you're educated, you are a husband, you should, in your will, you should write that land belongs to our family, land belongs to my wife when I'm not there. But still that culture is big in them. They don't mind about their wives, so we still have that challenge to go about.
Thank you. First of all, let me thank you all for being on this panel and for sharing your stories on telling women's stories. My question, I have two, but somehow I think the first one's been answered, but let me ask it if there's an addition, maybe it can also come across. I'd like to know how you feel about how to tell women's stories without falling into the trap of reinforcing stereotypes or alienating men. I know you've discussed it to some extent, but the question that I have that specifically is, how do you get men to also be involved in telling women's stories, and what that would look like? You know, would we have, you know, in a perfect scenario where men are telling women's stories, women are telling men's stories, and we're all telling each other's stories without any, you know, what would it look like? What would the men do? Would they be doing differently from what you're doing? You know, do you have any insights on that? I work with an organization that supports building capacity of all journalists and in Tanzania, and we are trying to amplify women's voices in the media and women's presence. And we work with male and female journalists. And I mean, typically we just have them all understanding you know, trying to help them all to understand gender issues. But I'm very interested in your specific insights into this, and whether you feel we are getting to a point where we could actually have a man maybe in Caroline's seat, or in Caroline's, sorry Caroline, I'm not trying, you know, but I'm wondering if we're getting there or what we need to do to get there.
Oh, thank you. Let me just, in our program with Farm Radio International, we had what we call male champions, because we thought if we don't involve men in this project, it would not work. So at the very start, we invited men. We trained them first before we trained their wives, because, you know, if you don't inform a man, then, I mean, if you call a woman for a training, the man will say, no, where are you going? Maybe you're going to town, or you're going to our own things. Or if you come with a radio or the phone, he'll say, okay, so Mr. X has bought for you a phone, such things. So we made sure that at the very start, we first train men, and we call them male champions, because we wanted them to champion, to take the information at the very start before we go there. So we had sessions, different sessions, at the station, at the radio station, so that men were also bringing out the challenges that their own women were facing. And actually, one of the female called Paul was giving a testimony how he used to, how he stopped his wife to own a phone. Whenever someone would call, maybe from a woman's side, mother, or father, then Paul would bring the phone to the wife. Hey, your mother is calling. After calling, then he takes away the phone. So, I mean, after that program, after involving him and going with him to the field and all that training, he came out to be a champion. Even up to now, I have some pictures where you find him, sweeping the compound, helping his wife in the banana plantation, and even carrying the baby. I think we have tried, and we think if we continue with that program, maybe men will also be able to tell stories, tell my story. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of the carrot and the stick. And this is the carrot, and I think it's important to do both. In terms of the stick, although I shouldn't even call it that, but I think, one of the, a big issue that I've had over the years covering Italy, again, is underrepresentation of women, which is just everywhere. I mean, you look at the news, it's a global issue, but it's particularly visible in Italy. And you know, I've done different things. I mean, one is certainly as editors is when you send someone out is say, you know, make sure you come back with quotes from men and women. And that's not going to happen with every single story, but just to say that's the basic standard. Like, you're doing nothing special by doing that. You just need to do that. The other thing that I've really become active in doing over the past number of years in Italy is every time I get a press release that there's a press conference coming up and it's an all-male panel or almost an all-male panel, which we call manels, I write the press person, who's almost always a woman, and I say, thanks for sending this, it sounds interesting, just to let you know I will not be going because there is not a woman on it. And I CC everybody now, or I actually go and find emails of people from the organization higher up, because at the beginning, if it was just a female press person, you know, she'd get back and it would end there. Now when I CC everybody, you know, there's a little panic in the organization and they get back to me. Always the same excuses, oh, we invited a woman, she couldn't make it, da da da. So I do that now, and then when manels show up, all-male panels at the Foreign Press Office in Rome, I always put up my hand and say, you know, I'm just curious why you think it's acceptable to come without a woman. And they get, you know, they get uncomfortable. And this year, I did that question in an all-male political panel before the elections, and it went viral. I don't know why at that particular time, but it just got picked up all throughout Italy. It became a news issue, and it's sort of, you know, and I, you know, I don't know if that, you know, there's a radical cultural shift since then, but I do know that a number of female journalists have told me, you know, that particular party or various organizations that would show up with all men now always make sure to put a woman, because they don't want to be embarrassed. So those are strategies that I've done as a journalist, is, you know, kind of public shaming.
I guess very briefly sharing an experience, you know, when I was running that news agency in Myanmar, I had both male and female journalists, and I always, like, you know, what Megan said, one of the things I did is, please see women's stories as not the domain of women journalists, yeah? You need to cover women's issues as well, because there is this perception that if it's a woman's issues, women need to cover it. It's a soft issue. It's not political. It's not market. It's not commodity. You know, it's not important. And I had one of my staff members who came in and said, I actually want to do a story about this young girl who became a prostitute after, you know, the family had a serious you know, financial difficulties, and the mother needed money, the father wasn't around. Of course, the son had to go to school, so the daughter has to give up her virginity for a few $1,000s, and that's how she became a prostitute. But she got really scared when, I think it was her mother who became HIV positive. She got really scared and she stopped, and then she tried to look for jobs, and she's now, you know, working as a sales assistant at a shop, and she earns a lot less money, but she thinks this is much better, you know. And it was in a sense a desperate story, but also it's a, you know, she empowered herself to doing it without any man or any other's help. And I supported him to do that story as a man. This is great that you're interested in it, and because he became a father and he had a daughter, and he thought, if it was my daughter, you know, and so it took a month, because it took so long to get their trust, gain the trust, and, you know, asking questions like, what was it like? You know, how sad did you feel when you were told this? What did you feel when you were coming back from meeting this old man? You know, it took a whole month, and, you know, that story won awards. But, you know, one of the feedback I got from one of the bosses was like, oh, 1 month for a story, that's just too long. You know, so it is, you're trying in a constant battle to, but, you know, it's good, try to find male champions of women's issues. They are there. They may not be very obvious, but they are there, and support them as much as we possibly can. I think that's, you know, that's all.
There's something to do about training too. You know, journalism schools, it's, there's a lot of work to do there too. You had a question? No? Okay.
remember you. I was just interested about what you were saying, that it's really difficult for, like, journalism is very privileged, and it's difficult to include people with certain backgrounds. And I was just wondering if there are any initiatives, particularly in the Reuters Foundation, to include people, particularly rural women, in journalism.
One of the things that the Thomson Reuters Foundation does is journalism training. So training of journalists from developing countries. That's what, one of the big components of what we do. And a lot of the times we focus specifically on developing countries because that's the journalists that we want to train and that needs more help. We don't have a program specifically just for women from rural communities, but part of our training is on covering women's issues and especially rural women's issues. We've been doing that for many years, and we will keep doing that for many more. I unfortunately do not have the power to hire people, but I'd like to think that one of the things we look at is not just what paper qualification you have, but what insights can you bring, and what kind of interesting things that you could say that we can't say. But yeah, it's a real fear that I have.
I have a curiosity about the technological divide, because I think that this is a big problem in many of these areas. Not owning telephones, not having access to the internet, that really makes the difference between these women living in these areas and, for example, us talking here and sharing stuff on social media and knowing of each other's stories. So in terms of awareness of what their rights are and what other women are doing around the world, that's probably a big issue. Not having access to information in a direct way. So is there anything, any project focused on that can make a change? I don't know.
Perspective, I cannot talk about, we don't have project asked on communication, but in our experience, rural radio in some remote area, a very effective mean of communication. And that, I work specifically on climate change issues, for example, which is a topic that needs to be, on which people need to be informed, and in many projects, rural radio work well. It's true that access to telephone is, I think, is not as widespread as people think in Western world, because there are many areas of Africa in particular where, yeah, maybe they are there, but depends. But rural radio, I think, are very effective. And yeah, I think we have many experiences in which we see how they really work well for disseminating information. So I think there are opportunities for sharing information also related to human rights and these topics that are less, on which IFAD doesn't work directly. But
yeah, I think it helps women to make an interactive agriculture sessions or programs on the radios, and because with this technology, radio and phones, a woman is able to call. You get feedback from the village if you have a program on the radio and you are talking about irrigation or any other modern method of farming, then a woman is able to use a phone to ask or even to inform about what they are doing or what they want to do or what you can help, maybe. And as I've told you already, we've been using phones. Like they sit together after listening to the program, then they discuss, then they also call, they call to the station. They get information and also inform you, or maybe what they want or what they lack in the village or in what they are doing. So I think if information is passed through these small media, radio or telephone, of course, for the internet, it can't be easy. It is not easy for a rural woman to use internet because most of them are not educated, but they are trained to just press, call, and then answer, and that's the only thing, or maybe the major thing they can do. But basically, radio programming and even listening to them and maybe calling, and yeah, it can work for rural women.
Who makes the call? Do they decide together who has to talk?
Yeah, of course they decide, don't think anyone can can call. But what they do, today they say, Raphael, Thin, you're going to talk about this. Then next day, because all of them must answer, by the end of the month, they must answer. It is a must. We want to listen to their voices, what they are saying. So we say at the end of the month, we shall make a roll call to see who has called and who has not called. So today they say, 3 of us will answer this question. Then tomorrow it's this and that. So at the end of the day, all of them, they have participated. Yeah.
Anyone else? Where to wrap up, I think. Well, I want to thank you all very much. And this has been an amazing panel. Thank you. Thank you all. Goodbye.
Today, the journalism industry faces many challenges. So we're introducing the Google News Initiative, our effort to enable journalism to thrive in a digital age. It will enable new models for sustainable journalism, elevate quality journalism, and ensure that technology allows journalists to do their jobs even better. Because when journalism succeeds, we all do.
Il nostro pianeta ha bisogno di un nuovo modello energetico e noi stiamo già facendo la nostra parte. Abbiamo ridotto le emissioni di CO2 nei nostri processi produttivi, trasformato raffinerie in bioraffinerie e il gas che produciamo in eccesso in elettricità. Usiamo energia rinnovabile nei nostri impianti e continuiamo la ricerca sul solare. Il nostro lavoro è produrre energia, il nostro dovere è farlo sempre meglio. Abbiamo l'energia per vederlo, abbiamo l'energia per farlo.
Journalists need to be protected, and one way to protect them is to share their stories and to pick them up and continue them as soon as you can, preferably before they die. You can't kill a story by killing a journalist.
Membership Puzzle Project is a research project at New York University. You join the cause because you believe in the work. And people who join the cause because they believe in the work are more likely to be loyal, which creates a stronger bond between supporters and journalists.
One of the founders of the movement of Families for Freedom. So we just wanted to make a campaign for demanding the rights of the detainees and their families and to focus on the rights to know. I feel love all the time. I feel love even to my enemy. Nobody teach them how to love, so maybe I'm responsible.
Today, the journalism industry faces many challenges. So we're introducing the Google News Initiative, our effort to enable journalism to thrive in a digital age. It will enable new models for sustainable journalism, elevate quality journalism, and ensure that technology allows journalists to do their jobs even better. Because when journalism succeeds, we all do.
Il nostro pianeta ha bisogno di un nuovo modello energetico e noi stiamo già facendo la nostra parte. Abbiamo ridotto le emissioni di CO2 nei nostri processi produttivi, trasformato raffinerie in bioraffinerie e il gas che produciamo in eccesso in elettricità. Usiamo energia rinnovabile nei nostri impianti e continuiamo la ricerca sul solare. Il nostro lavoro è produrre energia, il nostro dovere è farlo sempre meglio. Abbiamo l'energia per vederlo, abbiamo l'energia per farlo.
Journalists need to be protected, and one way to protect them is to share their stories and to pick them up and continue them as soon as you can, preferably before they die. You can't kill a story by killing a journalist.
Membership Puzzle Project is a research project at New York University. You join the cause because you believe in the work. And people who join the cause because they believe in the work are more likely to be loyal, which creates a stronger bond between supporters and journalists.
One of the founders of the movement of Families for Freedom. So we just wanted to make a campaign for demanding the rights of the detainees and their families, and to focus on the right to know. I feel love all the time. I feel love even to my enemy. Nobody teach them how to love, so maybe I'm responsible.